The technology behind the game can be cruel, even when it aims to deliver emotion and fun, even more so when it needs to deliver emotion and fun to the players. And because of that, countless NPCs and other players are sacrificed in the process. This story begins with a man staring at his computer screen while playing a game. He says it's exhausting, though the real world tires him out just as easily, especially because he is a soldier, and it's shown that he lost one of his legs. In a situation like that, the world tends to be much crueler. After getting up from the chair where he was playing, showing difficulty, he throws himself onto the bed. For someone who has lost everything, only vices like alcohol and cigarettes remain, as shown by his home. Lying on his bed, his face flushed from excessive drinking, he laments and knows it's his fault. While lying there, he reflects on his life. Unable to rid himself of the guilt, his eyelids slowly close. As if he had just closed his eyes, the next moment someone calls out to him. Still tired, his eyes slowly open as he complains about the noise. Now a beautiful woman with pronounced curves is shown in a bed. She complains about a headache, thinking it might be due to drinking too much the night before. But then he notices her long hair. That's when he gets startled, realizing his voice and body had changed to that of a woman. He could barely understand what was happening, but all those feminine parts didn't get much of his attention. Compared to the fact that he had legs again, now he didn't know if his legs had truly returned or if this was just a dream. But the sensation was very vivid. While he was touching his legs, someone called to him with a male voice. Frightened, he wonders if that is now his name, unsure whether the voice outside was calling for him. Still, he decided to answer back, saying he had just woken up and to wait a moment. As the person outside agrees to wait, he tries to remain calm. That place was nothing like where he used to live. The architectural style could be Mongolian or something close to Central Asia. The furniture and objects all looked antique. He had never seen anything like it, not even during missions. Like a flash, an idea came to his mind. Maybe this was something like in the stories, manga or light novels. He thought this could really be one of those reincarnation in another world scenarios. Looking at his legs, he prepared to try standing up, doing so slowly. Knowing himself, he places his feet on the floor and rises. Now a smile appears on his lips. With the feeling of how good it was to have his legs back, he gets dressed. After that, he observes his clothing. His body might have changed, and he could even be in another world. But just like in his previous life, he seems to be in some sort of military occupation. With that, he gives an ironic smile and thinks he has no idea who the original owner of that body was. Better not to cause trouble, so he should watch his words and behavior carefully. The protagonist finally sees the man he believed to be outside coming in. He watches closely to see who will enter, and his first impression of the person startles him. It was a massive man who radiated an aura as if ready to devour someone alive. Even when he served in the army in his previous life, he couldn't recall seeing anyone like that man. Then the man kneels before the protagonist. With that, he realizes he is in a position of leadership. He is the one in command. Even in front of such a large man, since he was kneeling, he felt he shouldn't be afraid. Staying calm, he asked the man what he was doing there that morning. The man, still with his head bowed, apologized but said he needed orders about what to do with the prisoners. The protagonist seemed shocked by this talk of prisoners. The man explained that there were 20 young men and 32 women, and that the younger women had already been assigned to serve the warriors. He told her that none of the warriors wanted women who didn't know how to ride a horse. The protagonist is shocked, wondering how to get out of that situation without selling anyone as a slave. Struggling with his own thoughts, he felt none of it made sense. Then he understood that these people weren't soldiers, they were a group of bandits under his command. The protagonist found it insane and couldn't allow this to happen. There had to be a way out. He then asked whether it was really necessary to sell them as slaves. Up until that moment, the protagonist didn't realize it, but the aura he gave off was terrifying. The man, head still lowered, said that if that was her will, then there would be no need to sell them. Given that, she asked him to send the prisoners back to their families. Having understood her orders, he said he would pass them on to the warriors. After they discussed this matter in a previous order to return and prepare everything, she could, later on, return to her tent. She thought she had managed to handle one problem, but she didn't know how to lead a gang of bandits and raiders. After thinking about that, she hears a noise outside the tent. It sounded like screams. Alarmed, she quickly leaves the tent to see what's happening. Unfortunately, she is faced with a disheartening scene. Those warriors handling the hostages as they screamed. Amidst the screams and the suffocating stench, the protagonist realized something had gone wrong. She hadn't escaped the cruel reality she faced in her previous life. What happened was that she had just entered her own personal hell. Seeing people lose their lives is nothing new to the protagonist. After all, he was once a soldier and saw many people die. But it had been a long time since he had smelled that metallic scent of blood. Or maybe because, back when he was a soldier, he was too deep in the battlefield to notice. Suddenly, one of his subordinates arrives, asking about Lady Harsel. The protagonist answers that it's nothing and that she's fine. but she wants to know what's going on over there and points to the vast number of bodies. The man replies that he was dealing with the prisoners just as she had ordered. Hearing that, she was shocked. She couldn't believe she had been misunderstood. Even more so when the man said that by her command, they were sending the prisoners to their families. The man stated it was simply the order she had passed to Captain Joman. That's when she understood that her order had been misinterpreted. All the prisoners' families were already dead. With clenched fists, she wondered what kind of twisted idea they had. Then, noticing that everyone was looking at her, she said Johan was right. She affirmed that it was indeed the order she had given. Maybe she was still a bit drowsy. The subordinate, laughing, reminded her that she had downed 5 bottles of very strong liquor the night before, and said she must be very tired. She goes back inside the tent to rest for a bit. Then she pauses to reflect that those names weren't unfamiliar. Harsel and Johan. Still in her tent with a bottle of liquor, she hears her subordinate calling her Lady Eshager, asking if she needs anything else, but the protagonist dismisses her, saying she doesn't. Yet somehow those names linger in her mind. Eshager, Harsel. Like a spark of memory, she remembers those two. They are both characters from Asterisk, the great warrior Johan, and Hercella, the mad Asterisk. They are leading characters from a game called Asterisk War of Remnant Asterisk. The game he had been playing, a strategic RPG for adults, was a somewhat popular title. Still, he had no idea how he ended up as a character in a game. Now it made sense why his outfit was different from the others. Short garments accentuating his waist. He could play at least 200 hours of that game. He knew the game started by entering the Hero Academy and the protagonist getting stronger. But it required excellent gameplay and had a high degree of freedom, with high-quality erotic illustrations, a hallmark of an adult game, and with that, he even sweat remembering the female characters. However, his euphoria quickly vanished when he remembered that he was now in the role of one of those female characters. The protagonist rides back to her village along with the rest of the group. Meanwhile, she thinks about the name of the body's owner, Eshager Harsel. She is also known as Hercella the Mad. Either way, she is the boss of the 3rd chapter of the game, the one who leads a nomadic tribe to invade the Empire. She is, without a doubt, one of the toughest bosses in the game. He remembered that, when playing, it took him over a full day to defeat this boss. But the most important point is that this boss has no future, no matter the choices made within the game. Hercella's fate is to be defeated by the protagonist. She is then captured by the Empire, and kept as a slave until the day of her death. But if she were to defeat the protagonist and take over the Empire, she would soon fall to the final boss and become a hollow shell. With those thoughts, she decides she can't let things follow the same path as the original story. And while she's thinking about that, someone calls out, pulling her from her thoughts. It was one of her subordinates who tells her they are about to reach Ordos. Her head is boiling as she needs a plan before arriving in Ordos to escape from these savages. Only then does she know she can have peace to live in this new world if she manages to flee from these bandits. While thinking, a spark of an idea hits her. Now she needs to put it into action, as they have already reached the capital. From a distance, the soldiers spot a caravan coming toward the Eshager tribe. After recognizing the flag and realizing that Lady Harsel had returned, they open the gates. With that, Lady Eshager Harsel has returned. Several servants bow to greet her. Many of them show their respects, bowing quickly. As she walks past several bowing people, she thinks that being the chief's daughter earns her special treatment. While walking, she thinks that this feels like something straight out of the Middle Ages. She also knows they're nothing more than stories and bandits, and that their downfall is inevitable. Meanwhile, some subordinates ask if she is going to see Lord Sirkin right away. She immediately asks if that is a problem. Sweating and trembling, the subordinate says that it's not a problem at all. Either way, the protagonist wants this to be the last time she sees him. Lord Sirkin is informed that Lady Harsel has returned to Ordos. With an angry expression, the Lord wonders why she came back, and after the chief is told that his daughter has returned, she is on her way to meet him. Taking advantage of the time she has before facing the tribe's leader, she uses it to go over her plan in her head. Now she needs to convince him to allow her to leave legally and become a citizen in the Western lands. As much as she wanted to simply run away, the protagonist knew that if she did that, she would be marked as a fugitive by those mad people. The West at the moment was the only place offering even the minimum level of safety. After walking through a corridor to reach the leader's chamber, there were servants kneeling at the door. They asked permission for Lady Eshager Harsel to have an audience with him. He then grants her entry. The woman, inside that room where she had never been before, enters with courage, for it is her only means of survival. Despite being afraid, she cannot show her emotions in front of that lion. As she starts approaching the leader, he only stares at his daughter with disdain. Looking at his daughter, he wonders what she could possibly want by coming to him. While she tries to adjust to the body and the changes, she must also have the guts to persuade that man. He is the first to speak, leaving a gap for her to respond, saying it had already been 3 months. And he immediately tries to belittle her, saying he heard she had gone out waving a sword, claiming she was conquering. While he still said he didn't expect her to be the one to approach him first, the young woman quickly apologizes. This causes some confusion for the man, as everyone around him is cold and belittles one another. He immediately wants to know what the girl is planning, trying to come off as a good young lady. Now that he, a former soldier, has the father of the body's original owner in front of him, he feels a bit confused. He thought maybe they would get along, but then he remembered that the young woman was considered the final boss in the eastern regions. It was then that he realized there must be something in the settings that he didn't notice or wasn't meant to see. Meanwhile, Harsel's father was being as harsh as possible, upset that she wasn't responding. Since the two were never close, he knew the girl wasn't there to check on his well-being. He wanted her to get to the point. The young woman, standing respectfully, soon says she intends to go to the Empire of the Easterners. The man mocks her, asking if he heard that right. Then she corrects herself and says she's asking for his approval to go to the Empire of the Easterners. The leader of those barbarians knew this was a complicated matter, so he asked if she had a death wish. He found it understandable that she would want to see her mother's homeland, but as she well knew, those people viewed them, the Carreras, as Easterners. To them, they were nothing but beasts. And he asked her if she really thought they would treat her any differently just for being a half-blood. Hearing what the man said, she could only think that she needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. She thought it was the only way to stay alive. If a war broke out between them, she didn't want to be there. That's when she said she knew he wanted to conquer the Great Plains. This made him raise an eyebrow. He slammed the cup he was drinking from onto the table and got angry at the words she spoke. He scolded her, saying that kind of talk could not be spoken so lightly, and a heavy aura filled the room. However, she trembled, trying to stay firm, as the atmosphere had changed drastically under the pressure he exerted in the air. The woman claimed she knew, and that was precisely why she intended to go to that empire. This caused some confusion in the man, but she went on to clarify things. She would use the Aishedger method to get what she wanted. Although it wasn't exactly reasonable, that was her bet at the moment. She explained they were skilled warriors and would claim territories. As they expanded, they would eventually face interference from the Western Empire. Her father, listening, knew it was a fact that whenever the warriors ventured into the plains, enemies would attack. However, she said the solution seemed simple: just deceive the people of the empire. With her final words, she left that monstrous man before her deep in thought. But she sought to clear up his doubts as quickly as possible. She explained that the institution in the empire, called the Remnant Academy, accepted young talents. Usually, only imperial students could apply. However, she planned to use the special admission system, since that allowed people from various regions to apply. All she needed was an academic recommendation. Of course, that was just a justification. She said that if they swore Aishan would not invade the empire, and if she remained as their hostage, it wouldn't bother attacking. He said that might make some sense, but asked if she really believed they would allow their lands to be occupied because of her. He made it clear that if he were in their place, he would simply discard her and ignore any diplomatic mission. The young woman said that wouldn't happen because they didn't want a full-scale war with that tribe. The man, seeing some logic, gave a crooked smile after his eyes flared with anger and made it clear he wouldn't fight for her. But she already knew from the beginning that he had no intention of saving her. Yet she pointed out that the enemies didn't know that. Unlike the West, which would immediately go to war if royalty were captured, they were not like that. Her father said the girl seemed quite well informed about an empire she had never visited. However, she would still need to answer a few more questions to secure her freedom. Releasing that heavy aura again, he asked if she thought his conquests would simply end there. That's when she surprised him, saying it was a great moment to turn the horses around and attack the empire. He wanted to know if she would do that even after swearing an alliance. She made it clear that they didn't exactly keep their promises. She also explained that the enrollment period at the Renaissance Academy lasted 3 years. And as soon as those 3 years passed, she would immediately advance toward Ordo. That chieftain tapped his fingers on the table a few times and then burst into laughter. The daughter simply watched her father's madness. The man said that for someone who only knew how to bite, his daughter had learned to speak like a snake. Then he became serious again and said she had his permission, saying she could do whatever she wanted, but she should hurry. Smiling, he warned her not to take too long because it would be boring if a war broke out before she graduated. As she stood to leave, she told him not to worry and thought of him as nothing more than a just traitor. After that difficult conversation with her father, the tribe leader, the protagonist wanted a hot bath. She thought it had been a long time since she'd had a proper hot bath. All the stress she had endured seemed to be fading. Looking at her hand, she thought she didn't want to get involved with those lunatics anymore, since she hadn't even managed to wash off all the mud. And just remembering that horrible scene of several captured people being executed made her stomach turn. Still in the bath, she clenched her fists. She thought she shouldn't dwell on it, since she wouldn't see them again. Even before leaving, her plan had always been to expose that whole gang of lunatics. Still in the bathtub, she thought that it had already been 15 days since she arrived there. A strange idea crossed her mind. What had happened to the original body, the soldier who liked to drink? She didn't know if she had actually swapped bodies with Housel or simply died in that state. The recurring question in her mind was whether if she were eliminated there, she would return to her original world. That made the character look at her reflection in the bathwater. She was, without a doubt, very beautiful. Moreover, compared to his reality, having only one leg and being an out-of-combat soldier, that body, even though it was female, was 1,000 times better and had the privilege of being a very beautiful maiden. She was thinking about these things as she stared at her reflection in the bathtub when someone suddenly shouted her name. After getting over the scare, she heard the person say that the equipment she had ordered before the last expedition had been completed. Of course, she became thoughtful about what kind of equipment this could be. After some time and already out of the bath, she went to check it out. To her surprise, they were gloves made from monster bones and scales. They came from a monster she had hunted last time. Since the materials were so rare, it had been hard to work with. Already apologizing in advance, she was told it wasn't possible to make one for both arms. When the box was opened, she noticed it was a claw and remembered the game she had played for hours. And it was exactly with that she had gained an advantage over the protagonist of that game. With just one claw, she managed to wipe out several soldiers, and for an Imperial artifact, it was quite durable. After playing for hours, she remembered clearly that Housel, even heavily injured, could still provoke the protagonist. Seeing that the man was leaning on his sword, which was already marked all over from the brutal fight. Her own condition at that time wasn't great either. She had a pierced leg and an arrow in her shoulder, and even with such wounds, she didn't show weakness, continuing as if she didn't care. That's why she was known as Hercella the Mad. And when the protagonist, filled with rage, charged at her, even then, she didn't show fear or anything like it. Even when the game's hero already had his sword raised for the strike, she remained still. The player remembered that the item he used in the final battle against her was the gauntlet. That was definitely the new one she used against the hero. Seeing the confidence in her eyes, the handmaidens ask if everything is alright. She immediately responds that it's not. The gauntlet released and emitted a sea of ice. That wasn't ordinary equipment, perhaps because it had been forged from a monster's material. Even with her high and adequate physical stats, it was still hard to use such a weapon for long. And when the handmaidens asked when she planned to leave for the Empire, she thought the rumor had already spread throughout the palace. Understandable, the direct descendant of Kan being handed over to the Empire. Even so, she replies that she wishes to leave the following evening, and on the next night, near the border with the Empire, she was already camping with her loyal subordinate. Johan informs her that in half a day's travel, they would reach the border. He also says it might be late, but he wants to say something. However, she would be going to the Empire alone. He should never worry. After all, she is determined. Even so, showing concern, he asks if she is truly alright with that decision. Such concern surprises her. She never thought someone like that could exist among the band of raiders. It was known that, among all her subordinates, he was the closest to her. It was almost funny. People like him were the ones who truly cared for her. It had been a while since she had felt that kind of friendship. It was almost like when she was a soldier. With a cheerful face, she said those Imperial weaklings wouldn't be able to do anything to her. She arrived alone at the border the next day, and upon arrival, she was immediately approached with hostility. She was startled at once, as this wasn't what she had imagined. She saw the flag of the one who, in the past, had led humans alongside 12 knights and conquered 5 kingdoms. He had also managed the feat of driving all other races from the continent, creating a land solely for humans. It was the strongest nation in the game to which the protagonist belonged. Despite its power, the Empire had 2 major thorns at its side. One of them was the beast men of the snowy northern plains, and the other was Kahar Eastern. At the time, the Empire had been forced to build a massive wall at the border, known as the Great Wall of Berenginia, and as expected of an Easterner, she was not welcome. She knew she had to calm the situation, so she raised a white flag. It signaled she came in peace. It was merely a diplomatic mission. However, the soldiers at the border didn't seem to believe the enemy stood right before them. They spoke in foreign tongues, and she understood nothing. She was upset. She hadn't imagined they spoke different languages. Since she wasn't understood, the soldiers kept speaking things she couldn't grasp. All of a sudden, she began to feel unwell, as if something was happening inside her head. With that, she lowered her head, bringing a hand to her mouth. She was visibly shaken. Out of nowhere, she began to feel dizzy, as if someone had cast a spell on her or something like that. She felt so sick that she had to lean on the grass to avoid collapsing entirely. With that, a soldier approached. He wanted to know if she could now understand what he was saying, constantly calling her a barbarian. Since our heroine is a warrior, she stood up, always keeping her eyes fixed on him. Without hiding what she was thinking, she said aloud that she knew it was rude to treat a daughter of the Serkins that way. Suddenly, she noticed the tone and frequency of her speech and realized it sounded like a poorly made arrangement. That made her deeply irritated. The elder nearby, standing just behind the soldier, commented, telling her that the language spell still needed some adjustments. That soldier was curious. He wanted to know if she was a direct descendant of Ishager. She confirmed and revealed her name, Ishager Hashal. Just hearing her name was already difficult for that soldier. To be sure it was the same person, he asked if she was the mighty spear of Kahar. Somehow that soldier made the protagonist furious, and she dangerously placed her sword close to his neck. With a threatening voice, she asked what he was saying, asking if he was tired of the life he had. He was visibly terrified, as if he had seen a demon right in front of him. While this was happening, the other warriors wanted to act, but he stopped them. He said there was no reason for more fighting. She would probably explain the reason for being there. Since fighting wasn't her goal, she quickly sheathed her sword but kept her eyes aggressive toward him. After seeing her put away the sword, he seemed a bit more confident and asked what brought the princess to those lands. Showing a scroll, she said she was delivering a letter from her father Orhan, and also bringing peace. The warrior stared at her, wanting to know if she really said she was there seeking peace. She replied yes and explained that she came to enroll in the Remnant Academy using the special admission method. Upon hearing that, the knight could hardly believe what his ears were hearing. Some time later, she was taken in a carriage to the city. In the window, we see a shadow, someone enjoying some tobacco, and that was the place the princess was taken to. That man in military attire was Margrave, who thanked the soldier for bringing her. Then he turned to the princess. He said he had heard about her and the commotion she caused at the eggplant wall. While he spoke, she simply observed that imposing figure in front of her. Besides his appearance, what he was consuming also caught her attention. She was curious because in her past life, she had been a soldier and had a few vices. One of them was tobacco. She wanted to know what the man was consuming. Smiling, he told her it was manna herb. He asked if she was surprised, since that herb didn't grow in the East. Having spent quite some time in the body of that young woman, the soldier inside was nearly drooling for a puff, and when the man offered it, she could hardly believe it and accepted immediately. The barbarian princess settled into the sofa as she tried that manna herb tobacco. Manna herb had the power to sharpen the senses and clear the mind, and it was less addictive than tobacco and caused no harm to the body. The man watched the young woman in front of him take a drag like a seasoned man and asked if she really liked it. He also sat down to get comfortable and told the young woman he could offer her a gift pack. However, he needed to address a more serious matter. He wanted to know about the peace agreement and the letter. He was sure all of it was just a ruse, a strategy they created to conquer the Great Plains. The protagonist hadn't expected to be found out so quickly. Her face showed an expression that revealed she didn't expect that man to be so sharp. But he said it was so obvious that it couldn't go unnoticed. He knew that behind a request for peace, there was always a hidden motive. While she just sat there thinking about her next move, he was already suspecting that her people had deeper intentions. With no other way out, she clenched her fists. At that moment, the only thing that could save her was honesty. So she said she would talk about his suspicions, but mentioned she'd prefer to speak with fewer ears around. She was referring to the soldier she had seen when she first arrived at that camp. Now that it was just the two of them, and they had already smoked and had some tea, they could speak freely. She decided to confirm his suspicions, saying that the peace deal was a front. Sirkin planned to conquer the plains, gather the army, and then attack the empire. He was also caught off guard when he noticed she was saying everything all at once. When asked if she planned to betray her father, she said she had never considered him as such. She asked him if it was possible to love a man who had taken her mother by force from the empire. Upon hearing that, Margrave widened his blue eyes. He showed interest, asking if her mother was from the empire. He wanted to know more about the girl's mother. She began by saying that her mother's name was Amela. She said she didn't know the family name, but she had blonde hair and blue eyes. After hearing this, he changed the direction of the conversation, saying that accepting such a proposal would bring disadvantage to the empire. He believed Orhan might want to use her against the empire, and that would display the empire's weakness. He explained that the empire had no plans for a full-scale war against the Karhar army on the plains. With her eyes fixed on him, she wanted him to accept the proposal. That way, he could help the empire, since refusing wouldn't stop the invasion. After what she said, he didn't understand how his reaction could possibly help the empire. He said that if it were about revenge, she wouldn't need to be there. Closing her eyes, she said he might be right. She explained that the internal atmosphere had been tense lately. If she hadn't left those lands, she feared for her life. With that, she revealed the real reason she came to the empire. She was simply seeking refuge. He thought she was different from the warriors of her group, as those warriors preferred death over fleeing. However, the protagonist confirmed that she had fled. She had chosen the lesser risk over the greater one. After listening to the young woman attentively, he let out a loud laugh, understanding what she was saying. Margrave was beginning to understand her point of view, deceiving the enemy to achieve her revenge. The woman, dressed in soldier's attire, bowed and introduced herself. At that moment, she revealed her name was Meat, and said she was a knight of Landenberg. Still bowing, she said she would be taking care of Lady Ashager Harsel. That military-looking man added that the woman was one of his most trusted soldiers. Of course, as the protagonist had once been an old soldier, she knew very well what those words really meant. That woman was there simply to keep an eye on her. Even so, she found the situation understandable. After all, looking at that young woman, she felt confidence overflowing from her. The man in military attire said that now that he had decided to help, he wanted her to cooperate as well. First of all, he wanted her to enroll in the academy with a special admission, which he would arrange. However, he made it clear that even with his recommendation, a final response from the emperor would be necessary. He said that when he reported the matter to the emperor, the young woman would have to serve as a witness, affirming the danger. As he said that her cooperation would be essential, she simply nodded. There was also another condition, a very simple one, which was to not cause any trouble within the empire. The young woman, with a mischievous look, said she would definitely do her best. Later, already in her quarters, she took off her cloak and stretched, as the day had been quite tense. Just thinking about how now, besides her father, she was also under the eye of that man in military clothing. Not to mention that she was no longer alone. Now there was an experienced fighter watching over her. And on top of everything, the princess wondered whether she should address that young woman as madam. Not really knowing how to label the girl, she asked if she should call her madam. The girl, however, bowing, said that wasn't necessary. Just calling her by name was fine. With that, the protagonist asked the young woman to call her by her name as well, Halshal. She also warned her that using her family name might draw unwanted attention. The young knight, besides being beautiful, was very intelligent and knew the girl was right. Her surname carried weight. A new doubt also arose in the princess's mind. How long would that girl continue to follow her? The girl replied that it would be until she was admitted into the academy or until Margrave gave notice. With all that, the warrior understood. Now she felt something like relief mixed with a bit of unease. She could easily accept having a pretty girl by her side, since she still hadn't fully adapted to her new body. The protagonist wanted to know what the girl wanted to do next. That's when the short-haired girl admitted that the little princess would have a training match against her. She explained that even with special admission, she had to demonstrate adequate skills to enter the academy. She knew her name was known throughout the vast empire, but rumors alone don't make a warrior. And besides, it hadn't even been her idea. It was her superior's. He had asked her to test the little princess's skill level. The two of them, already in the palace's outdoor area, and the protagonist asked if she could use that place for training. The girl replied that the space belonged to her lord and his heirs. She said this while handing her a sword. Now with both of them holding their swords, the barbarian princess wanted to know if her princes got along well. She was curious, especially since she would be staying there for a while. When the short-haired young woman said that all the chief's sons had perished, the girl turned her back to gain some distance to start the duel. But the princess realized she had touched on a sensitive topic. The girl, however, told her not to worry, just never mention it in front of the master. With those harsh words, the protagonist realized where she was stepping. After that young woman took a few steps forward, she finally drew her sword. However, once she did, she was no longer the same person. Her aura exuded a kind of demonic intent. That girl was the 10th sword of the kingdom, and she was about to begin. She was already watching her opponent ahead, and with that, she charged at full speed. It was truly an astonishing speed. She only managed to block thanks to the reflexes of a well-trained body, a woman who lived among barbarians. She thought there was no way that sweet girl from before could be the same person. Now she gave off a demonic aura. That's when she realized the girl wasn't just training, she was truly fighting. And before she could fully react, she was hit with a knee to the stomach. Of course, without wasting time, the girl prepared a second attack, aiming at her opponent's neck. The protagonist narrowly dodged it, escaping a fatal strike, and thought the girl was insane. Things fell off. Everyone had spoken well of the girl, gentle and kind. Now she was radiating a hostile aura. However, that short-haired girl, now fearsome, challenged the barbarian princess right to her face. Now the protagonist knew that if she showed weakness, it would be the end of her. Grabbing her sword, she asked the girl if she really wanted to test whether she was just some weakling. The girl simply watched her opponent, as her next move would be drastic. Fast as lightning, she launched an attack at the protagonist, who could barely defend herself. As the blows continued for a few moments, the protagonist managed to buy herself some reaction time and analyzed the movements. Now trembling all over, her body tired from barely managing to block the attacks, she knew it had been a bad idea. Her eyes widened. She realized she had gone too far. She shouldn't have provoked her. And before she could even finish her thought, there was the short-haired girl again, imposing herself. She also gave a compliment, saying the girl had an impressive defensive sense. However, she admitted that alone wouldn't be enough to win. If she didn't fight seriously, she would perish. While the protagonist didn't know what to do, the other girl was already preparing her final strike. But the princess came back into the fight, taking control and striking her opponent in the stomach. With that, she threw her opponent far, and when the girl hit the wall, she felt the impact. The girl didn't recognize the expression on the barbarian's face. Now her face had completely changed. She was no longer just a girl. She was now Herself the Mad. The girl felt a complete shift in the young woman's gaze. Her pupils were dilated. Everything indicated that her opponent's body was moving on its own, driven purely by the desire to fight. Since that was the case, the fight was about to get even more intense. She also drew her spear, holding it alongside her sword. She said they would now have a real conversation and called the princess the warrior of Karhar. Now both were emanating an aura filled with the pure desire to annihilate. They were ready to resume. The two resumed the battle with incredible determination. Every strike was precise. Both were willing to take the fight to its final consequences. The fight stretched on to the point where the protagonist started feeling dizzy. It might have been from the injuries she was sustaining. Her vision slowly began to darken. It was incredible how the body reacted. The dizzier she became, the more her inner self felt truly driven. That was when she heard a voice whispering in her ear that it still wasn't enough. She thought it might be a manifestation of her subconscious. The voice wanted her to finally bare her fangs. It wanted her to use the claws that were so lethal to end that girl once and for all. Deep down, she knew that voice was right. She would rely on anything to survive, since her opponent was monstrously skilled and she was already feeling the damage's effects. That's why the fight had to end before things got worse. At no moment did the clash stop. Only the sound of swords could be heard, and the rising dust was evident. They put their full intent into every strike. They fought as if each blow were the last. That's why the knight declared she would deliver the final blow. However, the two kept clashing, and it was clear both of them were in critical condition. In the next scene, we see the two of them in bed, wrapped in bandages, receiving a serious scolding. Margrave couldn't believe what he was seeing and wanted to know how they ended up like that. His voice was growing increasingly harsh. He wanted to know what had happened, but the two of them just looked at each other. After a while, the knight, feeling guilty, confessed that it was she who had suggested using real swords. When she said it had been her idea, he became angry and disappointed. Still, the young woman tried to defend herself, saying the princess wasn't just a helpless girl, but a warrior. The man, with a look of disbelief, didn't think the girl was being serious. The girl's eyes widened when she realized she had been reckless. After hearing about all that recklessness, he had to tell the girl that it couldn't be that way. He said that when warriors from her tribe fought, they didn't try to eliminate one another. The young barbarian princess couldn't believe she had almost been eliminated because of false information from some book. No matter how many times she apologized, the short-haired girl still felt guilty. However, night began to fall. The protagonist lay in bed, exhausted and aching all over. Before falling asleep, she thought her first day in the Empire had been quite intense. She also thought she had only survived by luck, because the warrior she faced was someone of high level. And only after that duel did she truly realize how much she would have to change and reach a higher level. She thought about that while looking at her sleeping roommate. And when the protagonist finally managed to sleep, the figure of Herself the Mad appeared. That sinister presence placed a hand on the delicate and unsuspecting face of the sleeping young woman. The true barbarian princess was upset because, if that insignificant copy had done what she ordered, she would have won. The royal physician pointed out, to the barbarian's dismay, that their major wounds had already healed. While Harsel could already remove her bandages, the imperial warrior wasn't supposed to be returning to training yet. Seeing the young woman's effort, the protagonist could hardly believe she was already working out. She thought maybe she had fully recovered. Seeing this, she even started to think that all imperial knights must be some kind of monsters. The physician explained that Nigel had always been like that. Since there was no way to stop her, he was about to leave. Watching the warrior's behavior, the protagonist knew the girl was famous for that stubborn nature and attitude. When the protagonist was a man in the military, it was common to encounter people with that kind of temperament, just plain stubborn. And she couldn't understand how someone as talented as that girl could be assigned to assist her. The short-haired girl, noticing something wasn't right, asked how the body was reacting. She said she was recovering now, but still had some difficulty walking. The short-haired girl said that was a relief. They had almost had to delay the schedule because of the princess's injuries. Harsel thought she was fine, aside from the fact that the warrior had nearly taken her life. However, Nigel had a question for the princess. She said it was a very sensitive matter and that she needed to think carefully about how to express it. However, Harsel didn't feel the girl had been respectful during their fight. Frustrated, the short-haired girl said that had been a situation between enemies as knights. Getting closer to her, Nigel wanted to know where she had learned imperial fencing. She said she remembered clearly seeing her use imperial fencing during their match. Even though she fought awkwardly, her basic defensive posture was visible. She wanted to know if, by chance, she had been using refined sword techniques that differed from the wild fighting style of Karhar. Hearing all that nonsense and after absorbing it, the protagonist could hardly believe they were thinking that about her. To defend herself, she said she didn't remember, but she had never heard of imperial fencing. Maybe she had just observed it, and repeated it. Very upset, the protagonist thought that after being hit in so many ways, she hadn't even realized what she was doing. Meanwhile, the young warrior disagreed, saying that technique was too complex to replicate just by seeing it once. She thought that, if it were true, the young woman must be a talent in imperial fencing. Awkwardly, she replied that she should try to learn it someday. She just didn't know if there was anyone among her people who could teach her. The short-haired girl offered to teach her, in case she truly wanted to learn. Of course, she would need to get Margrave's permission first, and she would also need to learn to speak the language, since her way of speaking was strange. By the next day, the two were already learning more about the Empire's language. In a different form, not the original. The protagonist was already very tired. She hadn't thought she came there to learn more languages. While the two were studying and distracted, Margrave returned and needed to speak with the princess. He had received a response from the imperial family and began to speak in a negative tone, as if things hadn't gone well. Then they began to discuss the matter, each with their mana tobacco in hand, just like two soldiers would. The protagonist was hoping for good news from that man. Noticing that Margrave began speaking on the subject and then stopped, she wanted to know what was going on. And regarding the approval, considering everything that had happened, she feared she had not been accepted. In response to her question about whether they were planning to fight against the Karhar people, the man said no. However, over 40% of the nobility had opposed. They found it incredibly difficult to trust an agreement with her people. Worried, she asked if he had really explained all the circumstances fully. But the man believed that if the information had been shared only with a few high nobles, including the emperor, it would have been easier. He also, frustrated, said that in the end, the problem wasn't just his. It all came down to her, because her reputation was notorious, and far worse than expected. She had left behind a trail of destruction in every place she passed. That's why they couldn't see her as anything other than a monstrous beast. She tried to say something, but he cut her off. Everyone had concluded there was no chance Aishager Harsel would give up. She asked if they just wanted her to go back. She knew that was a non-existent option. If she did that after finally getting this far, they would simply show her the end of a blade. Then he said that wasn't the case and placed a sheet of paper on the table, something that caught her attention. Shy, she admitted she hadn't yet mastered the imperial language. He realized he was being too delicate and said he would summarize everything for her briefly. First of all, she could not cause any unnecessary conflicts with the Empire or any other race. If she did, she would be arrested according to the law. She also had to agree to join the Imperial Army immediately, in case Karhar attacked. After graduating from the Remnant Academy, she would have to serve 5 more years on the front lines. The final clause was theirs. They would disregard all of it if she showed any interest in returning to the East. After seeking asylum, she would be considered a spy and arrested immediately. She was upset. There was nothing interesting in it. She wanted to know why they had made such a fuss over nothing. Smiling, the man told her he just wanted to see the cold, calculated reaction she would have. Standing up quickly from the chair and slamming her hand on the table, she couldn't believe he was simply joking with her. He asked her to stay calm, saying he didn't want to see her break the negotiation. He remarked that although he had said all of that, he wasn't just joking. He wanted to firmly remind her how much the Empire was against her staying. While she listened to him say that she should always keep that in mind, she clenched her fists and trembled with rage. She promised she would do her best and also follow all the rules he had imposed. So after everything she should and should not do had been made clear, they sealed the pact with a handshake. Time passed, and a man wanted to talk to Margrave. Upon entering the room, he said he had heard the details. He was curious about the 5th point of the negotiation. He had taken political responsibility for that girl. The man simply replied that the girl was his hope, though his soldier didn't understand. He said that when she first arrived, he was angry and planned to send her back. But after hearing that she despised Karcher enough to come all the way there, he changed his mind. He said the thought alone was thrilling. He wanted to see the leader of that group destroyed by his own daughter's hands. Nagel wanted to know why she was packing her things all of a sudden, and if something was bothering her. Visibly upset, the princess said that after hearing that man's story, it gave her a lot to think about. She already knew the Empire hated her people, but their reception was worse than she expected. She continued packing under the watchful eyes of the short-haired girl. The princess said it seemed it would be harder to move around freely. She knew that the moment she was seen in the streets, every nearby knight and soldier would chase her down. The short-haired girl wasn't holding back when describing the horror she would face. Since her people were known for hunting down lesser races and wiping them out, that's why her people were known for their brutal ways. Worried, she asked what she should do, unsure whether she should avoid it and go anyway, risking trouble along the way. Calmly, Nagel told her that if she remained loyal by her side, there would be no problems. Of course, there was more to it. There was a strong point. Many kind-hearted people liked Margrave a lot. Silent, the protagonist thought that she had already made it this far, and that alone was reason enough. Very few could do the same. There was also the Wall of Barinjal, which had been a major initial gamble. At that moment, she didn't know why he was being so kind to her. She even remembered the document he had signed, guaranteeing he would care for and take responsibility for her. The next day, the carriage was ready, and the two of them were set to depart. The short-haired girl informed the princess that they were now headed to the empire's capital. With that, she asked if the princess knew anything about the history or structure of the place, the Remnant Academy. A bit embarrassed, she replied that she didn't know much. She thought all she knew was that it was a low-level training institution. The girl thought it was actually a good thing the princess didn't know too much about where they were headed, and with that in mind, she gently placed some books on a small table and instructed her that since it would be a long journey, she could study some of them. Because she was on her way to the academy, she spent most of her time devouring the books. And when she wasn't studying, they were training with the short-haired girl, but this time they used wooden swords. Already absorbed in several books, the princess didn't even notice when they arrived at the capital. However, her friend caught her attention. Soon, they would reach the Margrave's residence in the capital. This intrigued the protagonist. She wondered if that man also had a house in the capital, and whether that was normal. The young woman replied that every time the Margrave visited the capital, he stayed in a small temporary residence. She explained they wouldn't stay long, but it would be enough to rest and plan for the future. Lying on the carriage bench, she thought it was a good thing. She had been feeling dirty since she hadn't had a proper bath. Upon arriving at that residence, they were warmly welcomed by the servants. The protagonist was impressed, as the young woman had said it was a small residence, but it turned out to be a splendid mansion. The butler, pleased to hear praise about the mansion, said he would show them the place where they would rest. The first thing she asked for was heated water for a bath, as she was very tired. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the young woman's father and the leader of the barbarians were ready to take command. All the warriors were prepared to depart as quickly as possible, and he called for everyone to remain on high alert. They could already see the Empire's knights just ahead. Shouting, he asked if they could hear his voice. He wanted the full attention of Aishajur's warriors. All eyes on him. His speech declared that they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. It was time to erase the humiliation from 10 years ago, and the 8 years spent living like cursed sheep. The leader proclaimed that the opportunity had finally come for them to become wolves once more and reclaim the Great Plains. His demand, given as an order, was for that band to take back the vast plains that once belonged to the warriors. That leader believed that, just as he burned with the thirst for revenge, Marenta too would be ready, waiting for him. With the goal of improving the protagonist's talent with imperial fencing, the girl continued training her. And as the training went on, the young woman showed enough talent to land another strike on her instructor. She was even managing to fight on equal footing with the one teaching her. Impressed, Nagel noticed she always fought with determination. She showed joy in battle. With that, the days went by, and the two trained more and more toward a goal. The short-haired girl told the princess that she had visibly improved as a swordswoman. She concluded that the fact she broke the wooden sword in one stance must have been partly due to the princess's physical ability. Compared to that first fencing match, she was now far more advanced. After so many compliments, the princess decided to speak up. She said it was necessary in order to avoid being underestimated. She needed to be prepared for the barbarian people or whoever else crossed her path. Nagel had news. Recently, the imperial family had officially signed a peace treaty with her people, recognizing the barbarians as a pseudo-human race. With that, the young woman no longer needed to worry so much. Moreover, as long as the name Lambert remained strong, no one would dare mess with her. Starting to tremble, the protagonist could hardly believe how that girl had a knack for saying ridiculous things. She knew that regardless of Lambert's strength or the imperial recognition, the Kahar, those who had lost everything because of her people in the past wouldn't sit back just because of a mere treaty. And of course, she should be prepared at all times for anything, especially when there was a voice in her head that seemed to want to give her commands on how to act, though the protagonist had no intention of obeying it. Even so, it was inconvenient. She kept hearing it, and this time it was so intense it felt like she had been touched. She was called to begin filling out the forms for enrollment at the school, and that's what she was doing. There were so many things that the young woman was already feeling confused. There were so many departments of study she was going crazy. While enjoying her mana tobacco, she noticed the clause stating that special candidates could demand duels under a teacher's supervision if both parties agreed. They were pleased. That clause was very useful. It could establish boundaries and avoid causing a diplomatic issue. It also said that entrance exams for general students started that day. The young woman wanted to know if she could observe. She seemed curious about the skills of the other candidates. In response to her question, Navel said she could, as long as she didn't cause any trouble. Of course, the young woman had no idea what she meant. Even though she knew there would be many people there who disliked her, once she arrived, it all came true. As soon as the receptionist saw the girl, she began trembling and stuttering. trying to find out if they wanted to watch the exam. Seeing that they wished to observe, she asked them to wait a moment as the girl waited. The protagonist watched people watching them and whispering about her presence. There were so many stares that she felt invaded, but the real Hercella was more than used to far more than mere glances. As for the protagonist, who was in that borrowed body, she would have to get used to it from now on. Egil knew that without a doubt. The rumors were frightening, and that's why they made so many people uncomfortable. The protagonist asked if they had already heard about her. They were, for sure, evil rumors. Rumors like her smiling while massacring people, selling women into slavery, and eating people alive. Annoyed, she replied that she had never eaten anyone. Those were certainly false rumors, most of them, at least. However, her knight and friend knew that not everything was just rumor, but she calmed herself because the person she had met wasn't like that anymore. The protagonist simply recalled the way she had looked at that girl while letting her dream of a future that never came. Many thought, when looking at her, that she was just a strange girl, but now she was in the cradle of the nation, protecting it. Harsel believed that if they had the chance, all of them would unleash their swords and attack directly. However, when she entered a room, her eyes widened. She saw several different races. They were the special admission students. The problem was, she remembered all of them. The young man with a serious face was Travel, from the Northwestern Kingdom. From the Dwarven Republic of Himmel, there was a small silver-haired girl, Asha. There was also the favorite princess of ARC players from North Cape Phelan. That was Frida, with her light-colored hair. Of course, since the game was originally intended for adults, she had seen them several times in dual cultivation scenes. The protagonist thought that seeing all the players again, but in person, brought back her memories. Travel, glancing sideways, mentioned that she must be the new freshman. He invited her to sit nearby, saying there was an empty seat there. Introducing himself, he asked if he could know her name. Looking at him and thinking he was quite intimidating up close, she said her name was Aishager Harsel. Immediately, he seemed to know who that girl was, since her name was famous. He told the young woman she must be from the East, because her name was very well known among humans. He asked if she was the princess that even children were afraid of. He raised his hand to greet her, saying he was from the Jin Empire. He asked if he could call her Aishager. While squeezing her hand tightly, the princess preferred to be called by her first name only. She thought he was a more casual young man than he appeared. Maybe he hadn't heard all the things about her properly. However, the young man said that they were all special admission students, and no one liked them, so they were in the same boat. He told her that with all those scales, it would be hard. She looked like she was trying to resemble a dragon, and everyone there was calm and admirable. They aimed for a composed attitude rather than anger. However, that young man told her she really should change her habits and stop eating humans. Out of all the rumors and comments, that was the one that bothered the princess the most. While she was having that conversation with a young man named Taylor, it was Frida who was watching them. Interrupting the conversation, she told the young man that his problem was always treating subraces like humans. She immediately received a furious glare from the protagonist, who looked at her with judgmental eyes. Realizing she had been noticed, Frida quickly asked the Barbarian what she was staring at. Still seated, the protagonist looked at the girl, showing her pity. She said there was nothing different about her, and that she was only proving she didn't have good friends. With no words to defend herself, that girl with long light hair became upset and made a threat. But when her threat reached the warrior's ears, Nagel quickly placed her hand in front, showing that the girl was under her protection and that she should show respect to the princess of the Northern Aqueduct. Travel found the whole situation very amusing. She also thought unnecessary commotion during the entrance exams would be a bad idea. Even Asha got involved in the conversation, asking if the two were going to fight. Suddenly, the atmosphere became tense and heady. Even the guy with the long gray horns, who was usually cool, started to heat up. And the one who should put an end to it all was indeed Princess Arsel. She said she wasn't there looking for a fight. After the confusion, now calmer, the princess asked what Asha was looking at so intently, since she had been observing something for a while. She took that moment to speak up and officially introduce herself. However, the protagonist already knew very well who she was, the character. After that introduction, the protagonist wanted to know what she was watching so closely in the arena. She replied, without taking her eyes off the arena, that it was a kind of study for her. Everything she did was to refine her equipment, and it looked like someone had just entered. The protagonist stared in disbelief when she realized it was the main protagonist, the handsome lead of the RPG game she used to play. That guy was none other than the Chosen One, the sword hero, the savior of humanity, Damien. Of course, in that place and at that time, people might not know much about that blonde boy. She knew that he was the one, the person who could change the terrible fate she would otherwise face. The inevitable could be avoided if she managed to get close to him. She watched him from a distance and thought he was handsome and fit the role of an RPG protagonist. Suddenly, she paused, realizing she was finding a man attractive. Blushing from her thoughts and the embarrassment, she thought she was going crazy. For a moment, she wondered if she was becoming a woman on the inside too, because she didn't understand those strange thoughts. However, analyzing the boy, she figured that regardless, he was the one she'd have to approach with a bigger goal. Not only she, but others also found that young man impressive. Taylor made them notice the one who stood as the blonde boy's rival, a man who appeared a bit older. He was tall and blonde, with long hair and a seemingly hostile face. While the blonde boy carried a large sword, that rough-looking man held an axe. The presence of that hostile man made the protagonist alert. She didn't recognize him from the game. The friend beside her told the princess that, judging by his clothing, he seemed to be from the kingdom of Dante. While the girls remarked that it was rare for someone from that dynasty to apply for the entrance exam of the Remnant Academy, the protagonist fixed her gaze on that man, who also stared back at her with hostility. When he muttered her name, he spoke with extreme anger and hatred, as if he truly knew the barbarian princess. She looked at him, suspicious, and listened to Taylor's question, wanting to know if she knew that man from somewhere. She was simply honest, as she truly didn't know him. Meanwhile, Frida was watching them talk and made a comment, saying that the perpetrator usually didn't remember. To them, barbarians who fought to bring peace to all, it was simply routine to have enemies they didn't recall. As the conversation heated up among the girls, down in the arena, the blonde boy was drawing attention to himself, as he noticed his opponent had lost focus and timing while looking up at the stands. The man, turning his attention back to the fight, gripped his axe tightly, his veins bulging. With his eyes fixed on his opponent, he apologized to the young man, admitting he had made the mistake of not focusing on the enemy in front of him. As he prepared to attack, he stated his name and said he was Sam's son. The young blonde also said his name and took his stance to begin the duel. Connecting, the two began launching themselves into the air to finally strike each other. The clash started quickly. While the fight was being watched by Harsel, she thought about the words Frida had used. They were truly irritating. She clenched her hand tightly to try to calm herself. She knew it wasn't simply the fault of the body's former owner. After all, she too had made decisions that led to difficulties for others. While still thinking about that pile of bodies she had to deal with back at the camp, the fight between the two continued. However, she knew she should focus only on that strange man standing before her. Taylor was pleased. The fight was great. Both were showing skills beyond expectations. He said that, unfortunately, the young hero named Damien seemed to be running out of stamina due to reckless attacks. The protagonist thought it was hard for someone like him, so promising, to lose even if he was still a rookie. However, she was briefly relieved. If he lost there, he wouldn't earn entry, and her fate could change. At one point in the battle, he had to lean on his large sword to keep steady. He was finding it very difficult. Despite appearances, his rival was agile and showed caution with every move. He knew he had no choice. He would have to give it his all. If he didn't want to lose, he would have to go for an unavoidable attack. Of course, his opponent immediately noticed his plan and wasn't about to fall behind. He decided to unleash the full power of his axe and thus subdue the challenger. After that fight, she was already heading back to Margrave's house and saw two men in an alley. For some reason, they were fighting. She noticed because of the sound of bottles hitting the ground. Nagel asked her how the admission exam had gone, but the protagonist didn't want to talk about it. The young woman saw she was different, visibly shaken. She still couldn't accept that her end was heading towards something tragic, especially after unexpectedly meeting the protagonist so early, and there was also a character she didn't know, who held resentment toward the true princess of the barbarians and revealed himself to be someone who could trouble her in the future. Just thinking about those two already left her intrigued, and her carriage ride back home, meant for rest, was quite turbulent. With all those thoughts, she could hardly believe those two strong fighters had ended in a draw. They couldn't continue because both had caused mutual damage to each other's weapons. Even so, both showed superior skills compared to the other candidates, and because of that, both passed thanks to the exam ending in a tie. Now she would have to deal with both. She knew she needed Damien to avoid her horrible end, even if that game was for adults and full of frenzy. And everyone knew that a fundamentally strategic RPG game required complete planning and thorough research. Therefore, selecting good companions was something crucial, and the versatility of that blonde protagonist, as a warrior, archer, mage, paladin, thief, etc., was extremely important. She knew that developing a great sword user to such a high level usually meant neglecting other skills. The protagonist thought he might want to learn magic alongside that big sword, but it wasn't something she could casually suggest. She had a doubt, so she asked Nagel about something Travel had told her regarding night levels. Trying to be modest, Nagel said it was hard to judge someone's abilities based solely on the entrance exam. She said that without a doubt, that boy Damien was the warrior who fought with him, and there was also a mage named Ophelia. She understood what the girl meant. Perhaps, after training with that relentless warrior, her own standards had risen. And now, those beginners were being called night level. It was hard to accept, since their skills weren't close to Nagel's. The protagonist thought about that while consuming mana tobacco as she rode in the carriage. After they arrived at the residence and spent some time there, the two trained for hours until the protagonist was exhausted. Nagel commented that she had done all she could from that point on to help improve her swordsmanship, and now only real combat remained for her to gain true experience. The short-haired young woman, seeing the princess collapse on the ground, wanted to know what she was thinking. "There's a mystery," she replied, wanting a bit of everything, though not mentioning she was nervous because the next day would be her first day as a freshman. However, the young woman didn't understand why the princess was worried, since she was very well trained. After picking up the swords from the ground, the young woman invited the princess to take a bath together. She was already in the bath when she saw the silhouette of a woman approaching. That's when she remembered the young woman had invited her to bathe with her, but she didn't know the girl meant they would be bathing together in the same tub. The protagonist felt uncomfortable seeing her friend, undressed, stepping into the same bathtub as her. The comfort was so great she even closed her eyes, her cheeks slightly flushed. Noticing something was wrong with the protagonist, Nagel approached and asked if she was, by any chance, feeling unwell. She thought that even though she was in a woman's body, her memories, thoughts, and soul were still male. Back when she was a soldier with no injuries to her legs, she had several girlfriends, but now seeing that young woman in front of her felt very sudden. That made the discomfort even worse. She thought the body was hers now, so physically everything was fine, but the girl in front of her still threw her off. The impact was so strong that the young warrior noticed the princess had become strange, so she asked if she had done something wrong. The girl thought that even though she had been invited by the princess to bathe together, she should have kept her distance. Not wanting to upset her, she stood up to leave the bath, leaving the princess alone. The princess tried to compose herself and said she didn't need to leave. She only acted that way because it was the first time they were bathing together. To ease the mood, she asked Nagel to scrub her back. It would be better for her that way, since her back would be turned to the boy. For a while, the young girl was scrubbing the princess's back, and the two remained silent for some time. Even in silence, the protagonist was thinking about a few things. She felt silly for asking someone to scrub her back. She thought she should start adapting, since she would have to live with other women. And there was also Nagel, who was always close to her. As much as she wanted to be kind, sometimes she just couldn't. She remembered seeing Nagel and Frida talking. When Frida was interrogating the young girl, she wanted to know her name and what position she held. She remembered the way she introduced herself, saying she was the 10th Sword of Landenberg. She recalled how that short-haired girl was able to stand her ground against Frida, who was bothering her. The protagonist had watched everything from a distance, observing their conversation and how the girl reacted. She knew that for Frida to make that kind of facial expression, the girl must have been truly impressive. Even so, she knew that she had given up her original position to become her assistant. To reach the bucket filled with foam that was farther away, Nadja had to lean forward. In doing so, she brushed against the princess's back. The sensation was so overwhelming that she fainted while trying to get up. However, the next day she was already on her feet, talking with Taylor as he passed by the two. They were carrying their bags when he said she seemed fine, especially after something quite exciting had happened the day before. Showing off his sweaty arm muscles, he told the girls that his body was also built through various forms of stimulation. Nagel said that was admirable. To the princess, it made sense for her to say that, since she was also addicted to training. Recalling the body, Nagel noticed that even though she trained more, the princess had more muscle. Taylor offered to show her the dormitory and the special section. Acting as her guide, he showed her several places, including the 2nd and 3rd floors, which were where the freshmen and senior students' dormitories were located, respectively. He also wanted to show her the other students with special missions, but it seemed there was only one person from the fairy race at the moment. That caught the princess's attention. She was eager to see a fairy. She thought that, in reality, she'd be seeing a race she had only heard about in Asterisk Fantasy Genesis Asterisk. In the actual game, unless someone set the world tree on fire, it wasn't possible to see a fairy. She wondered if there had ever been a fairy in the academy before. Suddenly, the young man knocked on the fairy's door. He wanted to introduce her to everyone. From inside, the fairy asked who it was. He answered that it was Calyx, and that he wanted to introduce the new student to her. Since he mentioned a new student, she became interested. But when the door opened, the first thing that came out was a strong smell. A cheeky fairy appeared in the doorway wearing a very revealing outfit, asking if that was the new student. Then she approached the princess and commented that it had been a while since she'd seen Karhar. The protagonist looked at that dazed face and her extremely vulgar clothes and couldn't believe it. Now she was feeling something strange coming from the fairy, something that felt oddly familiar. Getting close to Nagel, she whispered if that was really how fairies presented themselves in this world. But the young woman didn't know. It was her first time seeing one too. The cheeky fairy overheard and thought it was a harsh thing to say. It wasn't easy trying to live for about 300 years. The guy asked her if maybe it wouldn't be better to slow down with the drinking, or maybe drink less. The fairy said that if she could do that, she would have graduated by now. But she changed the subject and introduced herself, saying her name, then a shortened version to make it simpler. And when the fairy asked who that princess was, she said her name was Harsel Ishager. She said it was a pleasure, that she had already been there for over 15 years, so they probably wouldn't see each other often. After saying that, she closed the door and from inside said that everyone should just do their best. After a long walk around the academy, the two were finally settled into their quarters. After so much walking, the warrior decided to put on lighter clothes. She said that the complex was full of facilities, but her first impression was a good one. The princess thought the entrance exam seemed quite military in nature, but it was much more relaxed than she had imagined. It was clear that nowadays private dorms had a free dress code and voluntary participation. She thought they said there were only 7 of them, including herself, so it shouldn't be a big issue. The princess was anxious. Only an hour remained before the entrance ceremony began, and she wondered if they shouldn't go soon. Nagel told her that, according to the official letter they had received, students with special admission were not supposed to attend the ceremony. They said it was because the use of special admission students disrupted the uniformity of the event. The protagonist thought they were strict in keeping them out. She wondered if that wouldn't make things harder for the special students. To lighten the mood and relax a bit, she reached into her wallet for another Manna cigarette, but she was running out. Because of that, she asked her companion if she thought the academy would provide those magical smokes. Nagel explained that it wouldn't. If she wanted them, she'd have to get them herself. The problem was that the princess didn't have much money, so that was a bit disappointing. Making an angry face, the classmate suggested she quit using them, since she couldn't afford to buy them. She said that if she could have done that, she would have quit a long time ago. Hearing that, the classmate said she was just like the little fairy they'd met. She handed her a pile of paperwork she needed to look over. With no other choice, she sat down to review everything that had been handed to her. It was the dormitory regulations. It was like a kind of course program. Every time she heard about it, she felt a strange sensation, as if it were something between the military and a university. However, the general curriculum seemed to focus on theoretical training and basic combat during the first year. By the 3rd year, there would be more emphasis on frontline roles and imperial knights who would come for fieldwork. Since she was in her 1st year, she would focus on those basic courses. There was something related to faith. She remembered reading about it before. Reincarnates Academy was originally founded as a military educational institution by Emperor Carolus. However, over time, as changes were made and various influences came into play, one of them included the teachings of the empire's largest religion, the 11 gods. So that was how religious courses became incorporated into what used to be standard knight training. Of course, she wasn't getting anywhere near the topic of faith. While the princess read that, her companion acted like she was heading to her room. She said goodbye to the princess, saying she was going to rest. If she needed anything, she just had to ask. She thought that if she paid attention in class for now, things could go smoothly. Of course, she'd also need to get closer to Damien and other useful people during that time. And if she had the chance, she believed she should put those knave folks who were hostile toward her in their place. She knew that, aside from Nut, there were others who were just being cautious, so it wasn't worth stressing about. What mattered most to her at that moment were her living expenses. Looking back, she saw her sword and picked it up in her hands. She thought that if she sold it, she might get some money, but she hadn't gone that crazy yet. Looking at the sword, she thought that if things got worse, she could take on missions from the Adventurers Guild. Looking at the sword, she noticed something. It was one of the 12 swords that protected humanity. She didn't know if it referred to the 12 knights of Emperor Carolus. All she knew was that the item had already belonged to the princess. When she arrived in that body, the sword was already in the possession of the previous owner, and it came from the Empire, so it was probably from Harsel's mother. But she couldn't say for sure if that sword was truly related to the 12 knights. She thought her mother, Emila, might have been connected to one of the Empire's knights, but there was no way to draw a clear connection between them. After some time, she made her way to the banquet hall. When Asha noticed her approaching, she waved her arms to catch her attention. Seeing the princess and her personal knight, she invited them to sit with her. She wanted to know how she was doing and if she had moved into the dorm safely. But in any case, she was very busy. It was truly chaotic. The protagonist wanted to know what the young woman was doing there alone. She understood and said she didn't need an escort. She didn't need a machine at her back. The girl was her friend and her guard. Good morning, princess. She should prepare something. What she meant was that on the first day, they would be covering the basics, but she would have to show her strength in a special admission match with other students. That news caught the protagonist off guard. She didn't know there would be fights between those with special admission. Now she had lost part of her appetite upon hearing that she'd have to fight others. Worst of all was that the whole story didn't bring good memories. It was so bad it left her upset. With her head lowered, she glanced at her own hands for a moment. She believed that, thanks to relentless training, there was no way she'd lose. Looking to the side at her companion, she felt she should be grateful for all those long days of training. Then she remembered something. Come to think of it, this was actually a great opportunity for her. In that demonstration, if she showed overwhelming power and asserted dominance on the first day, it would be incredible. But if she started off by taking someone out, the weaker ones might see her as trash. Then she thought that if they did that, she'd take them out too. She thought of it as if some dark presence of the real Harsel was lurking nearby. She snapped out of it and realized she was thinking nonsense. If she did that, she'd be arrested and taken as a prisoner. She knew she'd been having strange hallucinations lately. While sitting and eating, she saw someone she really didn't want to see. It was Frida. The classmate beside her wanted to invite her to sit and eat with them, but the princess said she wouldn't if Frida was still there. Her friend understood. It made sense, since the two clearly didn't get along. The protagonist thought that she and Frida weren't even in the same year, so there was no reason to argue, not even to cross paths. Larissa was pleased because she had discovered something. The next day would be the big demonstration day. She was prepared with her gauntlet and her sword. The gauntlet wasn't the original one. She had bought another, fearing the overwhelming power of the original. She thought she should start looking for a job as soon as classes were over. While she was deep in thought, it was Asha who believed she had arrived just in time. She said she took a while because there was a lot to prepare, and she was praised since people thought she had changed her weapon and her bag. Now she looked really stylish. She explained that the bag was her masterpiece so far. It used a chrome structure due to its high resistance. They talked for quite a while about it, since it was her favorite subject, her weapons and inventions. After some time, the two of them were listening to everything being said while they waited for the evaluations to begin. She was starting to get annoyed. Every time she got close to strangers, that annoying rumor started again. Two people ahead were whispering and talking about her and the barbarian people she came from. Noticing that, she also saw that they were eyeing her friend. She realized those repulsive men were lusting after Asha. Her friend also noticed that the princess was quite famous, even if it was a bad kind of fame. Asha thought that it might be negative attention, but it was still a type of fame. At least it was a sign of strength. They were pretty isolated. Then she asked if the girl wanted to become someone famous. Without hesitation, she replied yes. If her name spread throughout the empire, her potential clientele would grow as well. She had heard that human society didn't share their technology with the outside world. She was definitely strong. Someone called for everyone's attention, asking them to quiet down. It was an imposing figure in military uniform, saying that all were welcome at Reincarnates Academy. It was clear that he was the instructor for humanoid combat discipline. He introduced himself as Fernandez. Fernandez concluded by saying that in this world there were many combat-related professions, just like the ones they all had. He spoke about frontline fighters, mages, priests, paladins, and archers. He stated that the personal combat course aimed to understand the characteristics of these various professions. He also explained that they would learn the proper strategies for each of the chosen professions. He understood that the excitement of joining the academy had left everyone relaxed. However, at their current level, they were no better than rookie knight. He said that until they all reached at least knight level according to the standards of Reincarnates Academy, he wouldn't be quick to smile and chat with them as he had earlier, while the protagonist watched him closely. The way he spoke, and even his clothes, made it clear that he was a soldier at heart. She thought it was a great lecture because everyone had understood that they needed to face warriors, mages, and priests. It was very beneficial to learn how to deal with all professions, but there were also knights on Nagel's level. The instructor continued, saying that if everyone had understood as previously stated, that morning's session would proceed with open sparring. It would be a chance to face their own abilities. If they had questions, they could ask him at any time. However, someone raised a hand. The boy who raised his hand wanted to know if he could choose his opponents from among everyone there. The instructor made it clear that if both sides agreed, it was actually encouraged to spar with someone unfamiliar to better handle diverse fighting styles. The protagonist noticed that when he asked that question, he looked directly at her small companion Asha. Seeing the man staring at the girl, she remembered he was the one who had said something weird about her before. She thought he wanted to fight that girl, but he would get wrecked. She was practically a human hunter, trained and equipped with everything necessary to destroy anyone, but she wouldn't waste her time trying to warn him. Besides, she knew he wouldn't understand. Once everything was explained, everyone in the courtyard looked like tiny ants. Even the protagonist was having trouble finding a good opponent. She thought her young friend already had someone to fight, and if she went up against Newt, things wouldn't go well. Her mission now was to find someone in that crowd she could fight without going overboard. That's when her eyes met the story's protagonist, the well-dressed blonde carrying a large sword. She took a deep breath and called out to him. She wanted to talk. He turned and saw her, or parts of her body. She wanted to know if his name was Damien. He became uneasy when he saw that young woman walking toward him. He asked if she was talking to him. She lit her tobacco as always, saying she had taken an interest in him during the entrance exam. She said maybe he could be a warrior worth fighting alongside. The young man was surprised and wanted to know if she knew him from somewhere. She extended her hand to him, and was about to introduce herself. She said his skills seemed pretty decent, so it would be good if they got along. However, to interrupt the handshake, a green-haired girl stepped between them. The protagonist already knew that girl and wondered when she would show up in the middle of their conversation. She was even somewhat polite to the girl, saying she wasn't interested in her, but in the guy behind her. The green-haired girl was Milia, who shouted that Damien shouldn't be fooled by that strange girl. She told him there were rumors that Carter performed soul extractions. However, whenever those rumors were brought up in front of her, she got very upset, as she wished harm upon no one. Damien wanted the girl to explain what she meant by soul extraction. Everyone started talking about why the villain from Karkar was suddenly approaching Damien. The shouting between the two drew everyone's attention to the situation. She also pointed out the girl's clothes, that revealing outfit that even showed her hips. The young princess said not even she had an excuse for that outfit. While Damien looked at her, awkwardly, she said she wasn't interested in men weaker than her. She just thought he had decent skills and wanted to get closer. But the girl shouted that there was no need to lie. She was clearly saying she was stronger than Damien. Getting very close to the girl, she said that if she wanted to believe that, they could find out in a fight. Very close to the girl, she added that she would go easy on her. Milia, in classic RPG games, was the childhood friend who loved the protagonist. She admired him so much that she followed him and enrolled in the academy as a knight candidate. However, her in-game performance was mediocre, and no matter how hard she tried to become a swordswoman, she couldn't even reach the level of a regular knight. Later in the story, frustrated by her lack of ability, she ended up wandering and eventually fell, becoming a demon. She met a tragic end as an unhappy character. The protagonist remembered that back when she was a soldier, she bought those games just to see something more interesting. She didn't understand why there were so many bad endings. Either way, seeing a discarded character like that right in front of her made her feel a bit of pity. The young woman paused for a moment, knowing there was nothing she could do, but she would try. She got mad, asking why she wanted Damien of all people. The protagonist replied that Milia herself had said she didn't believe she was stronger than Damien. She said now she would have to take responsibility for her own words. However, Milia didn't see any sense in that. Deep down, she knew the truth was that she didn't want to reveal her real abilities. But the princess made a proposal and said that if Milia won in the name of Aisha Pior, she wouldn't approach Damien anymore. She said that if that was the case, she'd do it. But the blonde guy could hardly believe his friend was doing that. He wanted to have an opinion about what the girls were discussing. He thought that, even though it was the first day and only 60 people were participating in the event, that was basically half of them. He thought it was completely pathetic, but announced that from that moment, the first basic spar of the personal combat class would begin. The rules were simple. The fight ended when one side surrendered or received a decisive blow. It was also announced that the weapons would be coated with hardened sludge to ensure non-lethal hits. If anyone had bad intentions, the instructor would intervene immediately. Everyone had been warned, especially if someone used magic. Power control would be essential. The princess had doubts about what hardened sludge was. Her friend said it was a kind of slime from a rock, which didn't last long. But if applied to a sword, it dulled the blade. As expected in a fantasy world, there were many interesting things. The instructor called the first group for the spar. They should step forward. Sasha said it was her turn. The protagonist wished her good luck. In the arena was the small silver-haired girl against a young man. Immediately, he started talking about her sword and said this was a real fight, and he wouldn't go easy. Not wanting to mark her face, he asked why she didn't stay with him while he was still being kind. Looking at her, he said it could be fun. The young woman replied that, by the way he spoke, he seemed confident in his skills. She quickly got ready to begin her attack. She had nothing more to say to him. When she launched herself into the air, she was confident enough in her own abilities. The protagonist knew this was exactly what she had seen in the game. The girl's opponent thought it was just a trick and believed he could defeat her quickly. She activated the jetpack charge, confirming the load and boost system activation. While still in the air, her movements were splendid and so fast they were almost invisible. The protagonist was satisfied, as she was now seeing with her own eyes what she had only seen in the games before. The extremely high critical rate against humanoid enemies for the girl wasn't due to any special reason, but simply because the attack zone was reduced due to her short stature. Truth is, the boy couldn't even endure a full attack and was already being carried away on a stretcher, convulsing. In fact, out of everything she had seen in her life, that scene was definitely among the top 3 most brutal. Even though the girl had grown quite introspective ever since she lost the lower half of her body a long time ago, it was still terrifying to see her use the move known as Egg Breaker and send that boy flying. The tip of the weapon she used was still dulled. She couldn't even imagine the pain that boy felt. The girl came back saying she had really missed that time. Back home, she didn't even need to think much about the height difference. The protagonist asked her if it had been refreshing. The princess thought flying with a rocket and launching your opponent into the air was absolutely amazing. She believed that for many, that object might be a source of fear, but it was actually really cool. After a while, everything started getting boring, and the protagonist nearly fell asleep. She looked at the arena. There was a dull and boring fight happening, but she had to stay focused because soon it would be her turn. Maybe because she had already witnessed such a major accident from the beginning, it wasn't really exciting to watch the others. Setting aside the main characters, she thought about this while watching the fight Damien was having. He passed by her and asked if she was worried about Nut. She didn't understand and asked what he was talking about, who she was supposed to be worried about. She wanted to know how he even knew that, and he, smiling, said Nut had been calling her name since the beginning of the entrance exam. He said Nut had requested a rematch to finish what he had started, but he had refused. It was as if he were hiding something, so he thought it would be good to tell her. Upon hearing those words, she gripped the hilt of her sword tightly. For her true ideal, holding back his real strength wasn't a problem. She managed to see a red-haired girl walking away, while a boy lay on the ground asking why. The young woman simply walked past him and with a touch of magic, ended that battle in a single blow. That also left the protagonist somewhat intrigued. That was Ophelia, the second daughter of Count Signos. It was the first time she had seen her up close since the entrance exam. She had only caught a glimpse before, but now she realized Ophelia was quick and precise. Invisible magic. That was also really scary. It was clear that, just like her, there were many dangerous people. The wicked woman from Kahar, the humanoid slayer, and the joint crusher. The protagonist noticed when Ophelia, with her tobacco lit, looked in her direction. But without saying anything, she simply turned her back and walked away. Now she didn't know why she had received that creepy smile. Still, she already knew about her own popularity. The next group was now being called forward to get ready. Everyone was watching. The next ones up were the protagonist and Nilia. The green-haired girl had decided to fight in Damien's place, so he wouldn't have to face anyone. As soon as she arrived, she reminded the green-haired girl that she had said earlier she would go easy. And now, thinking better, she found it difficult to control her power, but she didn't want to knock out a friend of a friend. She gripped her sword tightly, and when she did that, it was like she became someone else. With eyes more than terrifying, she told the girl she should give up halfway through. The girl wasn't willing to give up because she needed to prove her worth to her beloved Damien. She asked if her rival was scared, if she was afraid of losing that duel. She was sure there was no way that would happen in just a mere clash. She was so confident that she said she would give her a chance, and it wouldn't be her fault if the opponent got hurt. When the green-haired girl heard the others say she wouldn't be able to meet with Damien anymore, she became furious. She pretended not to understand and said she didn't know what the girl was talking about. The girl said that ever since the protagonist got close to Damien, she hadn't been able to hold back and wanted to duel. Meanwhile, the protagonist questioned what she had done wrong, dodging the girl's clumsy attacks. However, at times, that furious expression would appear, and it looked like the girl's eyes wanted to rip her apart. Tens noticed this and launched a blow that sent her flying, which certainly didn't leave her satisfied. She felt she needed to use that duel to prove that all the rumors against the princess were baseless. But she also needed to show her strength to stop people from provoking her again. She considered that confrontation a test to accurately measure the risk Hercella posed and knew that pretending ignorance about that lunatic would be a lie. Ever since the dreams began, each duel with Miguel made Hercella try to take over that body every single time. Either way, it was just a plan, but that girl was far too weak to endure something like that. At that pace, it made no sense to continue as there was no advantage at all, and she believed the school couldn't possibly make such an apprentice a knight. It wasn't surprising that the prince and the empire nearly collapsed in situations like that. She warned the girl that this was her last chance and that it would be better to give up, but she insisted on continuing the duel. Even though she didn't want to, she had to act, and with just one kick, she sent the opponent flying. The blow was enough to crush the small shield the girl was holding and make her fall to the ground, writhing in pain. The young woman couldn't understand how the shield had broken with just one punch from her rival. The protagonist explained that she was saying all of that for her own good, but since she refused to listen, there was no other choice. She approached the girl and drove her sword through her shoulder, being so careful that she held her head to lessen the impact. Everything about the green-haired girl seemed pathetic, but her determination to fight until the end was admirable. Unfortunately, she collapsed due to the intense pain of the wound on her shoulder. After that, she walked past Damien silently until she decided to turn and say something. She said that in the end, even without meaning to, she had ended up sending his friend to the infirmary. The young man replied that she didn't need to feel guilty or sorry for his friend, because she would be fine eventually. And since the girl had given her all, he would accept the result just fine, which the protagonist found strange and unsettling as he didn't get angry. As she was passing by, someone called out and asked her name. She answered that it was Harsel. The one calling her was Ophelia, the red-haired young woman. The protagonist just looked at her, not understanding why a high-ranking noble from the empire was coming to her. Being courteous, she asked if Ophelia needed anything. In truth, the young woman seemed to just want to introduce herself. She said she was the count's second daughter and mentioned her name. She observed the girl and said it seemed like she wanted more sparring practice, asking if she was interested. The protagonist just fixed her gaze on the young woman while trying to understand her intentions. Standing face to face, the protagonist thought she had managed to read her thoughts. With a more serious tone, she asked if she was compatible for an interesting fight. Ophelia said that wasn't quite it, but that, with her notorious reputation, it must be hard to find a sparring partner. The princess agreed, and the redhead said that, in exchange for a favor, she could arrange some opponents for sparring. She stated they would cover her tuition for 1 semester, and that the poor commoners would gladly accept that, since the academy's tuition was a burden for all of them. She asked if that could be considered a life expense. The girl's expression changed. The princess assumed she was imagining that she was being seen as pathetic. Opening her hand, she gave her a mango-flavored tobacco, saying that if that's all she needed, she could get it. She explained that the favor she wanted in return wasn't anything big. With a sinister voice, she said she just needed someone to be eliminated later. The young woman stated it was a capable warrior with no ties to the empire. Watching her strangely, the princess didn't understand why she was asking for something so violent. She thought it was just a training match, but Ophelia wanted her to eliminate someone. The protagonist tried to explain calmly that it would be difficult to pull off something like that in the empire. The red-haired girl insisted, saying it wouldn't cause much trouble since she was just picking someone out. The protagonist asked if she knew this person well, since, with that much influence, it could be dangerous. However, the princess was doing very well. She was smarter than Ophelia had expected. When she revealed it was her older sister, she said the woman was very powerful and that she didn't want her to keep breathing. She said it would be later, but she would clear the path for her without any issue. She paused, looked at the protagonist, and asked if she would agree. The protagonist thought it was insane. Her sister was already planning to eliminate the competition from the start. Just looking at the redhead was disturbing. Her family needed to be more united as the story progressed. She would accept, but only to avoid further problems with minimal injuries. When the fights ended, a small group remained, which caused a big impact. They presented themselves in front of the instructor, who observed them and commented that someone there had fought 4 times alone. She was truly terrifying. They were talking about the heroine who raised her sword high. She thought that, in a way, the opportunity had arrived. Now she could let loose and fight without fear of hurting someone too badly. There was a large man in front of her, holding a shield. He looked confident, so she charged at him full force. She thought that seriously injuring someone would be too much, but even so, she went all in. The large man saw the eyes of that wicked woman and was shaken. Her blow was so strong it sent him flying, without a chance to fight back. Now she was no longer Hercella, the mad woman. When she finished with that one, she called for the next, wanting to make the strength of the warrior people clear. That's how she went on, defeating every opponent who stepped up, trying to bring her down. Always asking who was next, she stood with sword in hand, showing her worth to all those who doubted her. She felt she had already proven her power to some extent, but there were still some who weren't impressed. She looked at a few and knew the number of victories she had, and the opponents she faced were few and weak. However, from above, when she looked down, she saw some things on the ground. She thought she had caused it, but it wasn't exactly what it seemed. Everything was getting out of control. The sword wasn't precise enough. Since, originally, Hercella the Immortal was a monstrous leader, it was to be expected. She believed that even now, in another moment, she could manipulate Danian on her own, but even so, she showed compassion to the one who had lost. Even after seeing what had happened to 3 members, another was still in the arena, willing to try facing that warrior. Looking at that young man in the center of the arena, she knew he didn't want to be there. Even so, he had the look of someone who had made many women suffer. And if that were the case, his popularity would be over in a second. In the blink of an eye, she was far away, but suddenly, she was close enough to strike. That one quickly managed to block her blow, but he couldn't withstand her furious gaze. Looking at him, she asked if he didn't think he was being a bit pathetic. He could barely stand. His attitude was truly questionable. When she saw his arm move, she had already calculated the punch. With that blow, he was pushed a bit away from where they were. Just like that, another one was defeated. He clearly wasn't very strong since she had tried to hold back. While observing everything, the instructor marked points and made his assessments. He didn't mind if the students got a little hurt. That reminded the young woman of when she was a soldier in the army of a certain country. Surely that memory would make her smile just by thinking about it. The next person who was going to try fighting her seemed to be a mage, but he didn't show much determination. Now it was tough. Only the working class mages were left. She didn't have much information. It was her first time seeing magical combat. But unless it was a special case like Ophelia, the level of those opponents shouldn't be high. Since everyone was using mediocre spells during the entrance exam, even the battle sessions were below expectations. She thought that if she managed to adapt from the start, she could overcome it, since she had a blessed body. As she got into her battle stance to begin. Meanwhile, in the infirmary, the blonde young man was with his friend Milia, she who had fought against the protagonist and gotten injured during the match. Zagara opened her eyes and was pleased to see him. He told her not to move too much. She said she was fine and apologized for making him worry for nothing. He was happy to see that she was okay, but there was something he needed to ask. He wanted to know why she suddenly tried so hard, since it didn't seem like her usual behavior. She confessed that she was very afraid to fight that girl, because she didn't seem like an ordinary person, but rather a monster. She knew how many people she had defeated. She had a sorrowful aura, and her eyes were lifeless. But back in the arena, she was prepared to fight that mage and wanted to see what she could expect from him. When she saw that he pointed his staff at her, she was curious to know what kind of magic he would use. Quickly, he cast some fire spells, but nothing impressive. She noted that he had made 4 large fireballs, but he was trembling from the start and couldn't control the magic. She found that understandable, since from his perspective, she must have been terrifying. But seeing that he could cast fireballs simultaneously, his skills seemed decent. Suddenly, she felt a sensation like static electricity surrounding her body. It was similar to what she had felt when she first arrived in the Empire, when the translation magic had been cast on her body. Now she didn't know if he had tried to launch a direct attack and failed. Observing from a distance, she found it quite interesting. She thought the magic flow she had just seen was a binding spell, although not a high-level one. The boy noticed she had surprising resistance to magic, since when he cast it, nothing happened to her body. He launched 4 more fireballs at once, as he had nothing else he could do. She stood still, waiting for his attack to come closer. She thought that, before things got more troublesome, she would take the initiative. So she quickly drew her sword and launched an attack in his direction. When she struck, the sword broke. She could hardly believe he called that a hardened sword. Now she was face to face with one of the boys' fire attack. He saw that one of them had hit her and was satisfied. Several others watched but stayed silent, not understanding what was happening. Smoke rose along with dust. A hand was already in front of the boy's face. It was the warrior, who now looked more like a beast, rubbing the boy's face into the ground. And once again, in the infirmary, the blonde, blue-eyed protagonist was feeling sad. He looked at his friend, who was injured and visibly down. Looking at her, he realized that's why she had said something like Barbara stealing souls. He watched her and couldn't believe he hadn't noticed it from the beginning. But he thought it was understandable, because on the outside, she was a woman with stunning beauty, a body refined to the level of a master. But the aura, the horrible atmosphere she carried, built from accumulated karma, was like that of a monster. He thought that, for some reason, she hadn't used her full strength against the girl, only a portion of it. Trying to comfort his friend, he told her not to worry. He had a talk planned with her for after the fight. Even though he knew Barbara's personality was strict, he believed she wasn't a bad person. He thought that maybe the rumors about her had spread due to her warrior background. He said his friend would talk to the girl later and see that she was actually a decent person. This time, it was a close call. She almost became charcoal. She thought it was a relief that her body's armor had withstood that terrible power indeed. However, when she looked at the young people on the ground, she figured the next opponent would also be a mage, and she didn't know if the armor would hold up. The next person prepared to fight her said she was someone with decent skills. He told her she was truly worthy of Lady Ophelia's recommendations. She simply called him a parasite, since he had sold himself for a few coins. When the rival heard that, he did not like the insult one bit. He said that, if it weren't a request from the lady, he'd have no reason to disgrace himself in a fight with Barbara. When she heard it was a request, she looked at Ophelia, who wore a gentle expression. She thought it wasn't surprising, the strange twist that someone with such skill would oppose her. It was to test her abilities, since they wanted to be partners. The opponent told her to get ready, because as a Barbara, she should at least measure up. She concluded that, as soon as he was hit the first time, he wouldn't be able to talk in that barbaric tone anymore. She placed the sword on the ground to support her arms. Now she could continue. She had been given a longsword and a dagger. Now she just needed to figure out how to deal with that person. She had to come up with a plan. She had never seen that opponent in the game, but people said he was notably strong among the new students. Even so, she couldn't reveal the hidden strength she was saving for the future, so she had to be ready to take a few hits. This was the final fight between the mage and Barbara. Once she had permission, she rushed at him with everything she had. She looked at him and knew she had to strike hard from the start. She couldn't relax like before. She needed to analyze him. The mage already had his staff ready and pointed at her. He cast some magic at her. She began to feel something, but that magic was pathetic and wouldn't work. That guy had already noticed earlier that she had some resistance to magic, and if that was the case, he would have to increase the power, thinking this as she launched at him again. When something strange appeared in front of her, she didn't quite know what was happening. She could have been in serious danger if she hadn't blocked with the dagger. She looked at her hand and noticed the magic was almost invisible, as if it were lightning magic. Now that guy was creating multiple fireballs and launching them in her direction. She had to dodge several times to avoid becoming barbecue. There was no pause between one attack and the next, so it was hard for her to move. When she noticed a small opening, she lunged at him. But it seemed like that was exactly what he wanted. Faster than her, he cast something that would keep her from reaching him. A magic barrier prevented her from striking him directly. Although she didn't understand what was happening, the duel couldn't stop. Then, a great power was released and hit that person directly, who screamed. After that flash, she was visibly thirsty for more, especially after getting hit. Meanwhile, the mage didn't understand why such a fierce attack hadn't been enough to bring her down. He looked at her and thought she was incredibly reckless. Not even the barrier could stop her. A barrier that, to be broken, normally required a full-force strike from someone else. The protagonist had no idea how much strength that body truly had. The problem wasn't strength, it was that she needed to use strategy. It seemed like she was being called again and was acting strangely, even drooling without noticing. It was as if she were waking from a dream, now behaving calmly. She woke up alone, unclothed, sitting somewhere. When she realized her clothes were gone, she asked where they were. At the same time, she heard the real voice telling her she was pathetic. It asked her why she was fighting someone in such a way. Covering parts of her body with her arms, she could hardly believe it was the real Hercella. She said, of course, that this was her first fight against a mage. Still, it sounded like a pathetic excuse. Hercella got so close she could hold the protagonist's mouth, telling her she had fainted from just one lightning spell. If she was going to use the body in such a disgraceful way, it would be better to just lose right away. Though the protagonist said she couldn't help it, and so, she would be given a lesson. She couldn't go all out in an academy duel. She had to hide some of her power, since they wanted to see them broken. And that was why it was pathetic. Even the position she was in now was pathetic. Even if she had to destroy everyone, she should never hesitate. She said the protagonist wasn't worthy. No matter the place or who she was fighting, she should always show composure. And when the fight began, she should strike her opponent with everything she had. She couldn't believe she had survived. Hercella said that now that she had been stripped down, she would show who the real one was. Meanwhile, the mage was looking at her, now with a more sinister air than before. He also didn't understand why she wasn't going down. She simply raised her arms and looked upward. She was loving that scent. It had been a long time since she had felt that kind of aura. The mage noticed the woman's atmosphere had changed, and she was completely different, like another person entirely. The man didn't know how she had recovered and was still walking with such confidence after all those attacks. He thought that anyone else would have had at least a heart attack by now. But she was walking normally and suddenly was on top of him, fighting fiercely. Even though startled by her movement, the mage quickly took a stance to counterattack. He noticed she had destroyed the entire barrier spell in an instant and thought he could hit her again. She simply grabbed his hand along with the staff and broke it. He crouched down and cried from the pain he felt in his hand. After that, she punched him in the head. He was deeply affected after taking that punch, and on top of that, she had grabbed his neck tightly. Someone was shouting for her to stop, and the examiner had to restrain and hold her back because she had squeezed her opponent's head too hard, and that's why the instructor had to intervene. After calming down a bit, she looked at the ground and noticed the mage was lying there. Hercella really was insane, just like everyone said. When the protagonist saw all of that scene, she could barely breathe. Some time later, she was back in her dormitory. Nagel was speaking with her. She thought the girl had been overly excessive in her movements. She warned her that even as a special admission student, the royal family wouldn't be pleased with the chaos she had caused. Upset and taking off her dirty clothes, she said the instructor had already interrogated her about it. She said the instructor wouldn't tolerate that. At least, that's what they said. She thought that, if the instructor had been nearby, he should have intervened earlier. Either way, if she kept losing consciousness like that day, Hercella might take control of her body again. She thought that, if she lost control like that again, she might not be able to come back at all. Navel was checking on her and asked if she had lost control and gone mad like the last time. She wanted to know how the girl was. For that, she said it was obvious. All one had to do was take a look. She said that with how much they fought, of course she would notice. There were also the rumors going around. She had heard that the girl was attacked with fire magic, and then tore the opponent's body and face apart with her bare hands. Her companion didn't want her to hurt herself in a moment of rage. She said that when she saw it and smelled it, she just couldn't hold back. She thought humans might be a kind of food for that girl, which explained her behavior. The young woman believed she could fix the flawed fighting style through practical training. She told the warrior she would do everything she could not to get hurt again. However, the young woman didn't want to hear it. She shoved her out of the room, telling her to wash up and head to the next lecture. The lecture had already started, and there were many prominent figures present. Still, the protagonist was extremely bored. She kept wondering what Nagel might be plotting. She truly couldn't figure it out. The next lecture would be an introduction to the hostile entities class. It was said that the term hostile entity might sound complex at first, but it simply referred to all beings, typical monster types like goblins, kobolds, trolls, and some spheres that had been destroyed or defeated and dispersed during the era of Emperor Karulho and the 12 Knights. Kahar also originally fell into that category. The demonic species, hybrids, void species, which began appearing on the continent at some point, posed a significant threat to people as demonic species. The protagonist thought that, unlike in the game, listening to and studying this information firsthand was important, since she could no longer directly control the sacred sword or daemon. At the very least, she'd need a paladin or a priest. Lastly, he would explain the foundation. He said that, in 2 weeks, there would be a field exercise on the topic. They should keep listening carefully, since it would be a field exercise. She would see the monster in person. It was a place where, if someone disappeared, it wouldn't even be considered strange. She thought it was the perfect place to attack Nut. After class, she wanted to know more about the field exercise and whether Nagel could go with her, but in that case, it seemed she definitely couldn't follow them. She wanted her companion to take the opportunity. She said that if they came after her, she would have no choice but to eliminate them. She wasn't going to start a fight, but if she had to defend herself, she definitely couldn't let it slide. However, Nagel believed the abilities she had seen were lower than hers. She thought Nut wasn't foolish enough to attack without a plan, so she assumed something must be in the works. She knew she hadn't even shown half her strength to that man. She had used nothing more than a longsword and a gauntlet. She hadn't even used the imperial sword techniques she had worked so hard to learn. She had also held back her physical abilities and wild instincts quite a bit. Except for the last one, she hadn't been able to control her Sella. In any case, that man had been fooled by underestimating the princess based solely on those tests. Nagel thought things would get much easier if they ambushed her in a monster habitat. They could also lure the monsters in for a surprise attack or draw them strategically into a war of attrition. In the worst case scenario, it was possible that they had hidden their true abilities from the start as well, since he seemed to have a personality that valued some kind of warrior's creed. Nagel knew that grudges were more impulsive than one could imagine, especially because things like honor, conviction, or pride were easily discarded. The protagonist also thought that, when facing an enemy, such things wouldn't matter. She figured she had about 2 weeks left, so they should start preparing too. That letter was a monster subjugation request. It was the practical training she had mentioned before. She wanted to solve the issue of instability when the princess was in prolonged combat. That way, she could prepare for the possibility of the enemy using monsters in an ambush. They would be undergoing direct monster subjugation training. She asked if it was something like a request from the Adventurers Guild. Nagel found it odd how she knew so much for someone who had just seen that paper for the first time. She tried to play it off by saying she had vaguely seen it from other students. They thought the timing was perfect, as they were almost out of money. Nagel had some, but was forbidden from spending it. She knew the rule was basically earn and spend your own money. She thought that, if they failed the monster subjugation, they'd have to hope the task wouldn't change. When they arrived at the location, the intel said it was a small dungeon with at most 6 trolls. They noticed there were fallen trees and a place to enter the dungeon. They tossed down a rope to descend into that hole. Beforehand, they looked from top to bottom and thought they were underestimating the place too much. Now they figured they should descend straight into that strange area. Just looking down from above gave the protagonist chills. The day before departing on that adventure, they met Manhua, a D-rank adventurer. She was trembling and sweating in front of the barbarian princess, who as always had a cold, expressionless face. After evaluating and looking at the timid girl, the protagonist thought she seemed a bit suspicious, but didn't think there was any real issue. Since that person would only act as a guide, she preferred that suspicious girl over adding a man to the team. For that reason, she accepted the stranger, shook her hand, and introduced herself. After introducing herself, the princess wanted to know what mission the two of them would have to carry out. Nagel told her that since she had already seen a dormitory, there was nothing particularly special. It would be just a few trolls. She added that if there was anything unusual about subjugating a troll, it would be their regeneration. Nagel knew they were stronger than humans, that matched their enormous size, ranging from 2 to 3 meters. The barbarian princess simply stood still, locking eyes with her companion, as if trying to understand what she was saying. Harshal felt like something was always off whenever her companion talked about a strength beyond normal. She noticed that she glanced sideways, exactly toward the barbarian princess. But she also had another question. She wanted to know what B3 meant. She explained that it meant the request should be handled by B-rank mercenaries. She said that, due to academy restrictions, they were only allowed to take on missions suitable for a maximum number of C-rank mercenaries. However, since she guaranteed she'd accompany them, the request was accepted without any issues. Now back to the present, they were already inside the dungeon and thought it was very dark in there. As soon as they descended the stairs into the dungeon, the protagonist looked upward. She thought that not even during her time in the military had she ever descended into such a deep pit like that. With the stench of decomposition, she was already starting to feel a bit nervous. Nagel, looking at her, said they could start walking as she was ready. Leading the two, she said that now it was finally starting to feel a bit like a real dungeon. The young girl accompanying them, glancing around, said it wasn't an ancient imperial ruin, but a dungeon from the racial war era. It was impressive how the girl could say all that just by looking. She said that for an inner corridor, the ceiling was excessively high. She believed the trolls there hadn't come from elsewhere. She thought they were a native species that had always lived there. Now the protagonist, standing and staring ahead, saw things she didn't want to see. It was a pile of various human remains that the trolls had probably eliminated, perhaps even other adventurers who had been there before them. It was astonishing that so many knights and soldiers were piled up like that. Nagel believed that currently, among the dungeon monsters, there weren't only trolls. An ogre was among them. Somewhat panicked, the protagonist asked if she was sure there was also an ogre there. Nagel had no doubt at all. You just had to look at those crushed piles, very different from troll attacks. At that point, the girl acting as their guide was trembling, afraid they might be attacked by an ogre. Nagel, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder, told her there was no need to worry. The ogre was a lesser monster than Arsel. Smiling, uneasy, the princess said it wasn't difficult. The only difference between an ogre and Arsel was that one was strong and the other was fast. She quickly drew her sword, as it seemed she had heard something, and now all of them were tense. From where they were, they could see the monster. It was large and noisy. It was so busy devouring its prey that it hadn't noticed the three of them. That's when Nagel said it was a good opportunity. The protagonist had to act, so under pressure, she said she'd handle it quickly before the ogre got close. She rushed toward that troll to eliminate it as soon as possible. Now the barbarian princess stood before that throne. She wanted to catch it off guard, so she advanced from behind. The monster was disgusting and loud. At that moment, it was chewing and growling. When she launched herself at it, she went all in. Right at the first strike, she tore off one of its arms, making it groan in pain. Unfortunately, she had missed her intended target. Her goal was to slice it in half in a single blow. Since it twisted its body as she attacked, it didn't work. Now she had to deal with an angry, wounded troll. The slash had also extended a bit across its torso. She thought the parts that were cut definitely regenerated more slowly than the rest. Now she wanted to know if all parts of its body regenerated the same way. She would start with the neck. With its club and insane rage, that troll was thinking of smashing the princess's head. However, she was much faster than it expected, causing it to hit only the ground. Immediately she got ready, gripping her sword tightly, preparing to strike again. The troll was now in the barbarian princess's sights. In a matter of seconds, her sword was already near its neck. Now she would put her theory into practice to see if all parts of its body really regenerated that easily. Once she confirmed her tactic would work, she felt satisfied as it had gone quickly. Then she heard a sound and realized that the time and noise she made were attracting more of them. Looking down the hallway, there were now more of them. The guide who was with them was terrified, because now instead of one, the princess would have to fight three at once. She even questioned whether they should go help her. However, Nagel discouraged her. Since she had destroyed one with strange ease, she could probably pull it off again. She told the girl they wouldn't get in the way. That's when the protagonist realized neither of them would help. Holding her sword tightly, she had to keep fighting. When she was about to be attacked, she dodged and thrust, aiming for one of their legs. Having landed a hit on that troll's leg, it roared in rage and pain. While targeting the others, she dodged and struck to keep the three under control. Then she had hit two of them, and the third was preparing a blow in her direction. Watching everything, the red-haired girl acting as a guide couldn't handle all that pressure. After the strike, a thick cloud of dust formed. After the impact, she looked at her hands and thought. Even though the body was Harsel's, even after being attacked by a troll, she barely felt any pain. Meanwhile, the girl was stunned. She thought something might have happened to the protagonist, but then she calmed down. By the way the girl was moving against the trolls, she figured she couldn't possibly be human. Nagel simply said she was someone who had trained a lot and deserved everything that was happening now. She asked if only the ogre remained now, and Nagel confirmed that was the case. She wanted to know if the princess was okay, but she was too focused on going after the ogre, so the question was ignored. She said she didn't know if it was because she had defeated them quickly, but she felt refreshed, as if she had just woken up. After saying that, she opened the large doors to face the ogre. She was very eager for a real fight. Suddenly, she stood before the ogre. She simply positioned herself properly and charged at him. Even though he roared with an axe in hand, she wasn't afraid of him at all. She charged in with a strike. That was the mission, and she was going to complete it. So she landed a blow right away that would cut or, at the very least, cause serious damage. Now that he was on the ground and she had her feet on his back, she thought she might have already completed the mission. A week later, she was fully satisfied with her mana cigars. She couldn't even believe there was still some money left after buying all those magical tobaccos. She still remembered the look of contempt her classmate had given her, but she didn't care. She was so happy she felt like dancing. She thought that if the money ran out in 2 or 3 months, she'd do it all over again. Asha asked the Barbarian princess if she had enjoyed her work as an adventurer. She replied that she had, saying it was quite fun. She said there was a certain thrill in destroying them. The only bad thing was the unpleasant smell. She confessed that this had been the worst part, and she struggled with it at first. She recalled how she started to notice that smell as soon as she was thrown into this world. When she saw that pile of remains, she nearly fainted on the spot. She said now she only felt slightly nauseous. But when she got into a fight, she no longer noticed anything. She felt victorious for having adapted to the environment of that world, or maybe that devilish body was naturally corrupting her mind. Whatever it was, she didn't want it to interfere with the life she was having in the Empire. She was sitting down, having a meal with the white-haired girl. She asked if anything had happened that week. She replied that the injured students had returned to class and had mostly theoretical lessons, but nothing particularly interesting had happened in any of them. Harsel wanted to know about the aptitude class. She had heard they were going to do a field exercise soon and wanted to know about the destination. While they ate a slice of bacon, the young woman said she hadn't heard anything specific. The girl wanted to know if they were really going to hunt real monsters during class. She said it was better than sitting through theoretical classes. Taking her glass of wine, she said she needed to finish some business. When she said this, Nut's image came to mind. After finishing her meal, she was walking down the hall with her mana tobacco lit. From there, she saw Danian and the green-haired girl walking together in the courtyard. Seeing the two of them talking, she couldn't just walk away, so she joined them, putting her arms around each of their necks and positioning herself in the middle. She asked them if they were on a date. Of course, that made Milia very embarrassed by the comment. She wished she had gotten startled because the girl suddenly appeared. The green-haired girl could hardly believe that the princess was implying she was out strolling around after recovering. Very annoyed, she said that he wasn't her boyfriend, just a childhood friend. She was so irritated that it left both of them somewhat embarrassed. Harsel told her that, either way, it was good to see she was feeling better again. She said that even though it was just a training fight, she thought she had been too harsh with her. When she said those words, Milia remembered what Danian had said to her when she was still in the infirmary. The girl said she didn't have to apologize so much. She was fine already, and was the one who had agreed to the training. She mentioned that she actually wanted to say something to the princess. Looking at the protagonist, she said she ended up in the same group as her for the aptitude classes and wasn't sure how to react. Hearing this, she widened her eyes. To her, this was a chance to get more information. Shaking the girl's shoulder, she wanted to know if she had any information about the practical details. She said she didn't have any information because, as she clearly remembered, no one had said anything in the last class. This destroyed the protagonist's thoughts since she really wanted to know about those matters. She couldn't ask her friend Asha either, as she had skipped the last class due to a lack of interest in the dull content. Time passed, and finally, the day of the training arrived. She was preparing herself as the time had come. She still remembered her friend laughing, saying that the special admission students had the most fun. While she was having a fit of rage, she stopped because she heard her name being called. It was the green-haired girl who was calling her. Milia walked slowly until she reached the princess. She was carrying a backpack with some things. This piqued Harsel's curiosity, prompting her to ask if she was traveling or something. It was then the girl revealed they'd be staying there for 5 days. She added that the other team members were waiting anyway. She was quite surprised by this, especially when she saw the other group members, becoming speechless. There was a guy she had already defeated and a religious child who probably held negative feelings toward her. She thought that whoever picked the group clearly hadn't considered her presence. After a while, they entered a gray forest, the place where, according to legend, one of Emperor Carolus' 12 knights defeated a stone dragon that had crushed several villages, finally burying it underground. In reality, it was a vast, uneven woodland with countless bizarre rock formations and elevations between the trees. It didn't seem right to let 140 academy students roam freely in a place like this, with trolls and other monsters around. The protagonist wanted everyone to start with introductions. That way, when fighting, she would at least know enough about each of them. She began by introducing herself and stating her name, adding that she could use numerous weapons. She was skilled with almost all of them. She also told them not to rely too much on her because she didn't intend to put in much effort. The next to introduce herself was the green-haired girl. She said her name and mentioned that the weapons she used were a rapier and a small shield. Next was the young man. He said his name was Hans and that he carried a shield and an axe. He also had a torch in case they encountered trolls. The next one to introduce herself was Lana. She said she was an apprentice battle priestess and was skilled in healing, so they should leave recovery to her. The protagonist thought that she wasn't skilled at anything besides healing. Over time, she'd surpass even the saints with her abilities. Trying to start a conversation, the protagonist asked what they planned to do at that moment. Hans was the one who answered her question, saying they needed to find a place to stay until the training ended. He mentioned hearing a flowing lake earlier and pointed in its direction. When she was about to say they should go, she sensed something and asked everyone to stay still. She noticed monsters approaching. They numbered around 10. Suddenly, several monsters appeared from behind a bush. They were kobolds. Hans asked the green-haired girl to provide cover. Meanwhile, those creatures aggressively charged toward all of them. The first monster that lunged at the young man received a shield to the face while he was already striking the next one. Milia proved quite agile as well, moving against those monsters without any hesitation. She was so impressive that she even received praise from Harsel. Now 2 of them were attempting to attack the apprentice priestess. The barbarian princess saw that the girl wouldn't do anything to defend herself, so she jumped in front of her. She easily eliminated the 2 monsters who were trying to take the girl's life. She was annoyed because somehow they always managed to drag her into situations she declared she wouldn't get involved in. She thought she was doing her best not to interfere, allowing them to learn for themselves. After protecting the girl's life, she asked if she was okay, and Lana, trembling, replied yes. Looking at that girl, Harsel wondered when she would actually start being useful to the team. After some time, they entered a cave. It seemed like a good place to rest, and frightened, Lana asked if they would be alright. She was afraid they might have to fight another group for that hiding place. Not being modest at all, the protagonist told her there was no need to worry since she was there. However, their goal was to find a base anyway, so they would finish and rest. Milia noticed the young man had a wound and assumed he had gotten hurt while fighting the kobolds. Lana said she would heal him, and since that was the case, the other 2 girls would go inside to organize the cave they had found. Following that plan, the girl stayed behind, attempting to heal the young man, who thanked her afterward. The protagonist watched in the direction where the girl was performing the healing and thought it was impressive seeing it with her own eyes. The girl gradually approached and sat down next to the princess, suddenly starting to chat. She thanked her for saving her earlier and mentioned that even though she hadn't fought much, she hadn't gotten hurt either. Then she asked if everyone from her group was strong, and Harsel replied that not all Karas had equal strength. She herself had her own curiosities about how that body had become so monstrous. Milia wanted to know what they'd do about the night watch. Even if they put something at the entrance, they'd still need at least 1 person awake. Hans thought they should rotate shifts every 3 hours. However, he said Lana wouldn't be able to handle an attack. Upset, the girl apologized for not being useful. The warrior said it was typical for a priest not to stand watch, so only the 3 of them would take shifts. Night arrived quickly, and everything seemed calm while the protagonist did her patrol. So calm that she sat down and admired the stars in the sky. While the green-haired girl was sleeping, the brightness approached her, causing her to complain about how bright it was. She thought the warrior had called her because it was her turn to patrol. She said she wouldn't sleep as she had some matters to deal with. Of course, the green-haired girl wanted to know what kind of business she had in the middle of the woods at that hour. She replied that it was something 2 children shouldn't see, adding that she would return by morning. But if she didn't return, she could easily avoid the trolls. From her tone and demeanor, the girl knew she was probably going off to eliminate someone. The girl even wanted to convince her to give up. It was then that the protagonist asked if she thought she could stop her. Compared to the immensity of Harsel's power, the girl felt small and almost insignificant. She revealed that everyone knew someone wanted her gone since the entrance ceremony, regardless if they were Easterners or Karas. The girl asked if she was looking for Nut, and she only replied that she should pray he didn't intend to eliminate her. Lighting another one of her mana tobaccos, she walked alone into the darkness. Having nothing else to do, she still had time to observe the stars and notice the girl wasn't following her. She felt somewhat disappointed, as she'd imagined that scenario differently. From the depths of her soul, she thought it was better that the girl hadn't followed until the end, as it would have been hard to find a way to detach from her later. Now she was reflective, and thought maybe she shouldn't have gone this far. When she saw a cloak and an axe leaning against a rock, she asked if it was him. She asked him if it wouldn't be better to resolve things through conversation. He also noticed her arrival and remarked that she was crawling out of the darkness, exuding the desire to eliminate someone. He said she was no different from a monster, and she made clear that he was also openly showing his intentions. She said things didn't have to reach that point, and honestly, she didn't even remember him. Because of that, she felt sorry. Yet she had to make choices to ensure survival for her own people too. She said if she could rewrite history, perhaps she'd change a few things. So even though it was shameful, this couldn't be settled through conversation. She spoke at length, even saying that if needed, she would kneel and apologize. Despite everything she was saying without stopping, the man remained still. At a certain moment, he stood up and said that a barbarian warrior shouldn't speak so much in front of the enemy. He grabbed his axe and swung it at her to finally fight, showing that words couldn't resolve this. Despite her apology, she noticed his strength was absurd and realized he'd been hiding his true power from the start. He said it was amusing that she couldn't even remember him. Those events had been nothing but mundane routine for her, and now she was merely offering an apology. His ancestors and homeland, the Danes, were a weak nation. Each man among them was a remarkable warrior, but they were few in number. They resisted the empire endlessly until finally being pushed to the brink of extinction. Fortunately, their ancestors were wise enough to foresee the fate of the Danish kingdom, so the kingdom separated from the empire. They swore loyalty, allowing them to live peacefully near their borders. He remembered when he grabbed his axe to go train again, and his younger sister begged him to stay. He had to explain to Artrid that a warrior couldn't neglect his training. She tried arguing in every possible way, saying there was no one to fight that day. When their father arrived at the door carrying game for dinner, he asked her not to be so hard on her brother. His father was satisfied that day, as he had managed to catch something good, and they were going to have dinner together. He remembered with sorrow his mother, father, and sister. He said he had days like that, happy ones, but now he could hardly recall their faces. All he remembered was that he had a warm and harmonious family, a peaceful life, even if it wasn't abundant. He thought those days would last forever, but gradually the flames and the barbarian invasions diminished his happiness, until the point when nothing remained, for they had been invaded by the Kara's warriors. Trying to attack those barbarians, he recalled the first oath he made, to grow strong, to protect his sister and protect his family. But the monster, which he didn't even know what it was, held his sister high in the air and asked another girl, who seemed about their age. That was when the barbarian asked his daughter if she wanted that girl as her slave. Indifferently, the little girl replied that the child was of no use to her. The girl who didn't care if her father eliminated someone else, or if she witnessed it as a warrior, was the protagonist. And now, exchanging blows, he told that warrior that she had left, taking everything from him. Little remained when he was found by a Dane who had luckily survived. He asked if she could now remember his mother and father, whose lives they'd taken, and about the cruelty his sister had endured after being discarded like some worthless toy. Displaying his powerful and furious aura, he asked if she truly thought, even for a few seconds, that she'd leave there unharmed. That was the moment he'd waited for his entire life, and he wouldn't waste a single second. He unleashed furious strikes in her direction, which she dodged. He displayed all his rage and fury in precise attacks, even lightly scratching the warrior's face. She kept insistently dodging, unable to strike after hearing such a brutal story. He continued trying to fiercely strike her for a long time until, finally, as the dust rose, she jumped away onto a tree branch, closing her eyes as if trying to remember something. She wondered what she was expecting when she confronted that warrior. She knew that, in reality, in the game, she was nothing but a butcher who took countless lives, and he was merely one more victim. She gripped her sword tightly, for that was one of the 12 blades that protected humanity. Charging directly at him, she told him to try and eliminate them, as that's what he wanted. Pointing her sword at him, her face filled with hostility, she warned him he'd better be ready. She said that, to save that world from impending destruction, she would survive no matter the cost. She demonstrated right in front of him that she was faster and more capable, unleashing a fierce attack toward him. He also quickly blocked, and while blocking found it amusing that she claimed to want to save the world. He told her she couldn't save anyone since she had eliminated thousands of Danes. Showing colossal strength, she managed to grab the handle of his axe, and when this happened, the man called her an ignorant bastard. She screamed at him that he knew nothing and couldn't say anything about her or the life she had. She said he couldn't even understand the emotions that brought her there. She also mentioned that he didn't know how many battles she faced to stay alive, but he responded that he didn't care about any of that. He no longer wanted to hear those illusions and incomprehensible words, the excuses of a mad woman who massacred people. He didn't want to know where that unreasonable power came from either, as he already expected it wouldn't be easy. He said his vow hadn't even completed its first step, shouting and releasing power. He declared it was time for his vow to return and fulfill its oath. Harsel noticed that suddenly the man's aura grew enormous, becoming monstrous. Drawing out a spear, he prepared to throw it at her. He couldn't afford to miss. Into that spear, he channeled a power called Opening of War, which headed straight toward her. Until that moment, she had only watched with a face marked by seriousness. It seemed Kint had poured all of his intention and years of hatred into that spear. The spear flew toward her, kicking up huge amounts of dust and creating a flash of light. The protagonist couldn't fully dodge and was grazed on the arm, tearing her clothing. She knew it was a sacred crusade from Volker, the god of warriors, and she thought it was a good strike since she hadn't seen it coming. Suddenly, this put her at a disadvantage in pure stats. If he were a mage, she could handle most with her innate magic resistance. Or if he were merely a normal warrior, she'd subdue him with swords and physical abilities. But a holy warrior was different. They could enhance their attributes with blessings, and their miracles operated independently of magic, unaffected by injuries. Fortunately, she knew quite a lot about that kind of attack. It would take him a while to recover the spear's power, and neither of them had healing abilities. Her plan was simple. She would close the gaps in hand-to-hand combat, denying him the chance to use his powers. With that mindset, she rushed toward him, immediately making clear in combat that she'd use brute force until the end. He dodged a few times, trying to find a weapon to defend himself. Once again, he asked the god of war to lend him strength, and by merely throwing a broken piece of the axe handle, he transformed it into a deadly weapon. Apparently, the object thrown in her direction should have hit her head. He even waited to see what had happened. He actually managed to hit her face. An attack like that, on anyone else, would have separated the head from the body. However, for her, who was practically a monster, it only resulted in some scratches. She told him that hadn't been a dodge, and asked him to stop calling her a monster. When people had nothing else to say, they used that word. Seeing that she wasn't normal, he realized he needed to end the battle before it was too late for him. Thus, he gathered his maximum power. The whispers and emotions gave him memories of the prophecy. Now looking at that man, the protagonist knew she was in trouble, as he had more power than she'd imagined. She was still sane enough to fight, but perhaps it was time to call her Sella into the battle. While she considered this, the man continued to attempt striking her repeatedly. As she dodged, a few minor attacks still managed to hit her body, although she was also causing significant damage to the enemy. That's when he realized she was using an Imperial swordsman's technique. Extremely angry, he asked if she thought learning Imperial techniques would make her a hero. He seemed even more enraged than before, shouting that she was nothing but a monster. Furious, she launched herself forward to attack him with just her gauntlet, yelling that she'd come this far precisely to avoid becoming a monster. At that moment, she was making peace with her other half, as if sealing some sort of pact. She was trying to show everyone she wasn't crazy, yet she had allowed her Sella to handle that part. As her hand pierced through the warrior's chest, he asked her if she'd truly come all that way to not become a monster. He stepped away from her after receiving that blow, but it seemed it was already too late. The wound had been deep. He was showing clear signs of being unwell, but he looked at his spear on the ground, afraid to pick it up. He thought it couldn't end like this. He would do something, even if it meant completely burning his body. He knew greed and hunger would bring eternal conflict. Thus, he would become a monster too. When he said this, before he could finish speaking, the gauntlet covered his mouth, and the warrior threw him to the ground. She began attacking him in an even more crazed manner. After all that assault, not much remained of him. She walked away upright, victorious, raising her sword. She had finally survived another battle. Meanwhile, the protagonist found herself messy in a sea of blue, as if she'd just fallen off a cliff. She was raising the sword to deliver the fatal blow when she noticed the inscription on the blade. Her expression changed abruptly. She paid attention to those words. Suddenly, a sharp pain overtook the arm wearing the gauntlet. The intense pain caused her to fall to the ground. Removing the gauntlet made the pain stop. She realized that once again, her mind had been consumed, not once or twice, but several times. Now she was suspicious of the gauntlet. Something was definitely wrong with it. The enemy, coughing, perhaps choking on water or something, asked if she really believed she wouldn't become a monster. He thought that girl was a joke. Saying something like that after everything she'd done was contradictory. He said he despised her. She slaughtered others and then claimed it was just to survive. Yet there she was. She was incapable of reaching her goal and ended up useless. As he said this, he raised his hand toward the sky, as if reaching out to his sister Astrid. With his eyes almost closed, he said he would watch her futile battles from the celestial palace, where he would reunite with Astrid. After this, silence fell. She knew it was the end for him. She looked at him and said she was sorry. She regretted being unable to explain everything to him. Soon, many people would disappear from that world, not just because of her or her people, but also because of beastmen and demons. Everything would only get better when Daniel became the hero. Yet she also thought explaining was pointless. Perhaps he wouldn't understand anyway. She said this as she lit another tobacco. This was just the beginning. From now on, more people like Nut, who held resentment toward her Sella, would continue to come. She thought this was awful, as she'd never done any of that. She barely escaped and tried to live correctly, only to end up like this. She seemed worn out as she lost a lot of blood in the battle. She would probably faint soon. After a long time, she woke up entirely bandaged. She was in the cave, being cared for by Milia. Seeing she was awake, Milia asked if she was alright and conscious. The first thing the protagonist did was drink some water and ask what had happened. Lana wanted to ask her what had happened for her to have so many injuries, all serious. She said the wounds were deep, bleeding heavily, and she even had a curse that would have been worse without Lady Shout's blessing. When she heard about the curse, she thought it must have come from the gauntlet. Lana was so furious, her face purple with anger, shouting at the protagonist nonstop. When the green-haired girl arrived, she asked Lana to calm down. Since things had turned out okay in the end, all the protagonist could do was stare at them. Holding her severely injured arm, caused by the gauntlet, the protagonist said things hadn't ended that well. Milia put her hand on her shoulder and said it was okay. She knew she didn't have a choice. Considering how she ended up in that state, everyone believed her. Thus, the field training finally ended after several unexpected twists. Of the 140 participants who started, 126 returned. 14 were missing or presumed dead. One of the supervising knights had also disappeared, but Nut's name was not listed among the deceased. Back at the Imperial Rebirth Academy, Navel was changing the protagonist's bandages. With so many injuries, it was hard to believe she fought only a single enemy. She revealed that the man she fought was a holy warrior of Volvert. Navel didn't think it was a big deal. She should easily get through it. But that also explained why she was in that condition and why the injuries were so severe. While treating her wounds, Navel mentioned this was just a temporary solution. The protagonist didn't want to call the Academy's priests or healers. She thought the wounds might raise suspicion. Navel agreed her reasoning made sense, but mentioned it would be costly, especially including repairs to her armor. She thought it would be nice if Lana were around, but she hadn't returned from the church shelter yet. Therefore, there was nothing she could do. She didn't know when she'd see her again. Nagel had another issue to bring up, temporarily confiscating the magical tobaccos. She made the protagonist promise not to use them. After changing the bandages, it seemed she had a visitor. It was her friend Asha. As soon as Asha entered, she asked if she was alone in the room. The protagonist replied yes, explaining her roommate had gone out briefly to repair the armor. Asha said she'd become worried after noticing her absence from classes, not even seeing her around campus, so she decided to visit. After hearing about the duel with Nut, she wanted to know if it had been good. The protagonist was speechless for a moment, as she hadn't expected the girl to know about it all along. She supposed it made sense since she herself had made a big scene during the opening exam, and now, with Nut out of her way and her bedridden state, it could arouse suspicion. Then she asked Asha if she wouldn't tell anyone, as it was supposed to be a secret. Asha replied she wouldn't. It's not like she had anyone close enough to share the information with. Well, if she did, she probably would. The protagonist then asked her friend for a favor. She wanted her to make a sword. Asha replied she'd already said she'd do anything for her, so it didn't matter if it was a sword. She was curious, however, since she knew the warrior already had a sword, and it was quite good. It emanated a Jin essence. One could easily sense the high quality of the blade. The protagonist knew this Jin essence was something extremely expensive in the game. No wonder she had defeated an augur with just a single strike. She said that weapon was too good and valuable to be used recklessly. Asha asked if she wanted a black iron alloy blade. It dulled quickly, but was extremely durable. She also requested a pair of gauntlets similar to the ones she used previously. Her friend said everything would cost just 20 gold. She agreed to pay, as the weapons would certainly be worth every bit of the 20 gold. Lying on the bed, unable to move normally, she stared at the ceiling, lost in thought. When she recovered, she would accept some adventurer missions to make money again. She looked at her hands and felt that all her efforts up to this point had been in vain. She believed that in 2 months, a secret organization of beastmen, militias operating under the orders of the Northern Beast Kingdom, would launch an attack on the Academy after infiltrating the capital. This incident would result in at least 30% of Academy students losing their lives. Before another tragedy could destroy that life, she had to stop everything at all costs. 10 days later, the protagonist had recovered enough to once again use her mana tobaccos. She looked around, unsure about what exactly she had to do next. She should be preparing for the beastman's attack. She cared about her friend. Despite searching everywhere, she couldn't find a single strand of hair. It was too soon to give up. She found it all such a headache. Considering her status, it was hard to continue alone or even convince Navel to go any further. She figured she'd fall behind a bit at that rate. She opened the door and went inside. She saw Damien and Milia talking there. As always, she approached to join the trio. Each time, she was becoming more polite and quiet, asking if she could sit beside them. The green-haired girl asked if she had gotten enough rest during that period. The blonde boy wanted to know if they'd gotten closer during the outdoor training. For him, it was a relief. As he'd said before, The two of them had talked a lot and had strengthened their bonds. The protagonist heard the girl say she had received help. However, she was actually the one who had been carried around. She completely changed the subject, asking the blonde boy if his team had caught 3 trolls. He said it had been quite troublesome. However, it had also been an interesting experience. She thought he shouldn't say it was troublesome at his current level. He then wanted to know about the first time she'd attended the theology lecture. He wondered if she'd developed an interest in religion. She thought that, in the game, it was just a scenario to distinguish priest characteristics. But since she was there, it seemed to be more than that. Milia asked if she'd be alright, as the lecture seemed really boring. For her, the boring part would be that she couldn't use her magical tobaccos during the lecture. She figured she'd just end up getting scolded. She really thought she should correct her habits. Afterwards, she watched the two of them getting along happily, unaware of the future awaiting them. She wondered if there was a specialist in any particular field among them. Sometime later, she was knocking on someone's door. She needed to speak with Princess Frida from the Archduchy of the North. They stood at the front lines blocking the beastmen, who frequently invaded through the Sky Mountains. So surely, Frida would know more about the beastmen than the Academy professors, but there was one problem. Upon entering the room, someone asked who it was, and the highly unwanted princess introduced herself. Frida didn't like her presence. The two hadn't liked each other since the beginning, which was why the girl slammed the door in the protagonist's face. She thought about how Frida had blushed around her during the entrance exam, just as she had. She knew Frida had always hated her, treating her as if she weren't even human. Having the door slammed in her face was too much. She tried opening the door, but it was too heavy. That made her decide to knock it down with a few kicks. Seeing that, Frida went mad with rage. Frida asked if she'd gone crazy, barging into her room like a beast. She didn't want to chat. The protagonist simply wanted to know more about the beastmen. Holding Frida's hand as she tried to punch her, she asked Frida to listen to what she had to say, as it was something extremely serious.
Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.